Chapter 271, Golden Rose 19 Hope Street, Sherwood Borough. This area was located close to the Tussock River which went through Backland. Pedestrians could see the turbid but unusually wide water surface through the cracks and crevices in their houses. The Daily Observer reporter, Mike Joseph, alighted the carriage and pointed at a three-story, grayish-blue building ahead of them. He said to Klein, who was standing next to him and wearing a black double-breasted suit and a half-top hat and gold-rimmed glasses, "That's the Golden Rose, the best legal brothel in the area of the Backland Bridge, as well as Sherwood Borough. It opens at 3 in the afternoon and stays open until 2 in the morning. The best legal brothels in the Sherwood and Backland Bridge regions. In other words, there are better ones in these two regions but they're illegal." Klein silently mused and shot a glance at the entrance which had an inlaid golden rose. It didn't hang any signboards. "This doesn't count as a street girl, right?" he answered without thinking. "Of course, it's of a higher grade." Mike personally led Klein to the front of the building and pushed the door open. As soon as he entered, Klein caught a whiff of a mixed fragrance that was slightly pungent and heard a soothing yet suggestive melody. Instinctively, he looked around and saw bouncers, in black coats and half-top hats, standing on either side of the entrance and in every corner of the hall. As a legitimate business, they were obviously meant to deal with drunkards and boors. The Golden Hall was surrounded by all sorts of sofas, chairs, and even a piano. In the center, there was a dancing area. At that moment, there were many ladies sitting in different areas with their hair colored in gold, brown, pale yellow, or black. Some of them looked mature, some shy and young, some young and attractive, and others who were rather beautiful. These ladies were either enjoying the melody, giggling whilst in conversations with each other, quietly reading newspapers and magazines, or dancing with the men. It was only 3:30 in the afternoon, so there weren't many customers. At a glance, this place looked more like a proper ball than a brothel. If you come after 8 in the evening, you'll see some interesting performances. If any of the ladies catch your eye, go over and invite them to dance and then ask them for their prices amidst the beautiful melody. If both sides can come to an agreement, you can head to the second or third floor and have a wonderful time in some room. As long as you're willing to spend money, you can sleep here the entire night." Mike turned his head from left to right, suddenly losing his previous calm and gentlemanliness, appearing a little more frivolous. He walked into the hall with a smile, and he approached a young girl who was at most 15 or 16 years old. Is he showing his true nature, or is this in conduct of a professional? Klein watched, a little flabbergasted as he subconsciously followed behind Mike Joseph. The victim, Sibber, was only 16 years old. In theory, a girl of similar age is more likely to be a friend and would know more. At that moment, Mike lowered his voice and explained. He then raised his thin eyebrows and asked in a normal voice, "Which lady caught your fancy?" "I'm just your bodyguard," Klein responded with very normal logic. Mike slightly nodded and suddenly laughed. "I'm not used to being watched when I do that sort of thing. I'll be standing watch outside." Klein understood what Mike meant, and took a serious, professional stance. Without another word, Mike walked up to the young girl, bent down, and extended his hand, inviting her to dance. Being a prostitute at this age, Backland sure is so bedazzling and dirty. To think that there would be a middle-aged gentleman of seemingly good bearing patronizing this place. Even the sides of his hair are white. Klein lowered his hands and stood very straight, watching Mike and the young girl engage in a slow dance. After a few minutes, Mike walked back and said to Klein with slight annoyance, "It's too expensive." As the two approached each other, he added in a low voice, "The girl knew Sibber, but the owner, ma'am, Lopez, forbids them from speaking with anyone else on this matter, otherwise, they would be severely punished." God, when the punishment was mentioned, the poor girl even shuddered instinctively. I can imagine how horrible it must be. Helpless, Klein sighed in sympathy, and asked in a suppressed voice, "So, what are you planning to do?" "I don't want to cause trouble for those girls again. I plan on going straight to Ma'am Lopez." Mike patted Klein on the shoulder and said, "Protect me." Klein turned his body to the side and warned in a serious tone, "If we encounter a dangerous situation, you must listen to me. Do you understand? Listen to me." "Okay, okay." Mike raised his hands to his shoulders and nodded. As he spoke, he walked towards a single sofa in the corner. There was a charming lady, with thick makeup, in a gorgeous dress seated there. "If you don't want to give up after a dance and embarrass yourself in front of those girls, I suggest you talk to Ma'am Lopez first and find out the prices of the different girls." Mike raised his voice. The lady heard their conversation and looked over. She slowly got up and smiled. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Lopez. Did any girl catch your fancy?" "Yes." Mike suddenly sized her up and said with a chuckle, "I really admire you." "I admire you too. You're acting like this is your home." Klein's mouth twitched. Lopez's expression froze for a second, then she gave a fake laugh and said, "Sorry, I'm not feeling well today. You should know that there are times every month where women feel quite under the weather." Seeing that there was no way to get Lopez into a room for a conversation, Mike fell silent for a few seconds before suddenly turning serious. "Ma'am Lopez, I'm a reporter. I wish to understand more about Syber's matter. Here's my documentary proof." Lopez's face darkened and she replied impatiently, "I've already told everything I know to the police. You should ask them. Syber was a vagrant orphan who was adopted by me. That night, she accepted an invitation from a guest to spend the night at his house, and she died on her way back in the morning. All right, please leave. Or invite a lady to dance." As she spoke, Lopez waved over two of her bouncers. Klein stepped in to shield off Mike Joseph and escorted him back to the hall. Upon seeing this, the two bouncers didn't rashly chase him away. After a few steps, Klein said in a low voice, "She's lying." "Oh." Mike turned his head in surprise. When she spoke, her eyes darted around. "She didn't dare to look at you directly, but she was also secretly sizing you up, which means she was lying and watching your reaction. In addition, her stance was highly defensive, and she appeared very agitated." Klein gave his analysis. Mike opened his mouth and exclaimed after a few seconds, "You really are a great detective. Only with your keen observation and outstanding deduction skills were you able to discover such useful details." "That's only because I had my spirit vision on and could see that Lopez's emotional colors weren't right. I came up with the reasons after." Klein smiled and said, "Thank you, it's time for us to go." Mike Joseph looked back at Lopez and saw that she was walking towards the side door of the hall, as though she was going to her own lounge, and that the side door was in a corner of the room. It was very quiet around there, and there were many areas in the hall that couldn't see what was going on inside. There were also two bouncers standing guard outside. "Perhaps, we should follow Ma'am Lopez and observe her reaction. Maybe the anxiety from just now will make her do something." Mike suddenly turned his head to look at Klein. "Can you take care of those two bouncers quickly?" "Sir, I'm only responsible for your protection, and that's against the law." Klein smiled in response. "I'll pay you more. A total of £5 based on the combat price from before. If there's another fight when we run, it would be £10. Mike Joseph gritted his teeth. "Deal." Klein reached out and shook his hand. Afterward, the two of them circled around to avoid the two bouncers from before and quietly approached the side door. "Guests, please stop. Please leave this area." One of the bouncers stepped forward and stopped Klein and Mike Joseph. "Sorry, we'll immediately." Klein bowed politely and apologized. At that moment, his right fist suddenly punched out, heavily striking at the bouncer's abdomen in front of him. The bouncer instinctively clutched his stomach, his body bent over. As for Klein, who had now stood up, he raised his left hand and chopped the bouncer at the back of the head. Pow! The bouncer fell to the ground and fainted. His companion was clearly caught by surprise at this turn of events. He just stared blankly and failed to react in time. Klein immediately slid over and covered the bouncer's mouth with his right hand and punched his abdomen with his left fist. Bang! The bouncer suddenly bent down and spat out his undigested food, and Klein promptly withdrew his right hand and chopped downward with his palm. At the same time, his left hand supported his opponent, allowing the bouncer to slowly fall onto the ground without making a sound. After exchanging looks, Klein turned the knob, pushed open the side door, and stepped inside. Mike Joseph lowered his body and quickly followed. "Why are you so skilled? You're just a reporter." Klein lampooned under his breath, walking briskly but at a rapid pace along the paved corridor. Suddenly, they heard Lopez's voice. "Tell Capim not to send anyone over in the next few days." "Capim? Send anyone?" Klein looked at Mike and found him looking equally puzzled. At that moment, they heard Lopez's footsteps that were headed towards the corridor. "Let's go." Klein tugged Mike and ran for the exit without turning back. During this process, he closed the side door and broke the lock in passing. It could prevent the people inside from coming out for a while. Then, as if nothing had happened, they hurriedly walked through the hall and approached the exit while hearing faint, angry voices. After reaching the streets, Mike heaved a sigh of relief and said in amazement and sincerity, "I've experienced many similar scenarios, but not once was it as simple and relaxed as it was today. Thank you. I need to return to find out who Capim is." As he spoke, he took out his wallet, fished out a 5-pound note, and muttered, "But frankly, your price is really expensive. It's worth more than half a week's salary. But you can claim for reimbursement, right?" Klein answered with a grin. Following that, he asked in concern, "Aren't you afraid that Lopez will find your newspaper firm and get the police to arrest you? That's a fake ID card." Mike Joseph shrugged with a gesture of familiarity. Klein could only admire him. After watching Mike board a carriage and leave, he walked diagonally across the street, waited for a public carriage and kept an eye out for anyone chasing after him. At that moment, a rental carriage slowly approached and stopped in front of him. A middle-aged man in a black coat stepped out the carriage and nodded at Klein. He had blue eyes, a thin face, and gray temples. It was the same old gentleman that Klein had seen in the Golden Rose. "He's not a customer of the Golden Rose. He's just like us." Klein suddenly came to this realization. "Hello, I'm Detective Isengard Stanton. I'm assisting the police in this case. Can we have a chat?" The middle-aged man pointed at the carriage tracks.
Chapter 272, Observing Each Other Detective? A colleague. However, the fact that he's able to assist the police in dealing with such a serious case shows that he truly is a well-known detective, at least within Civilau's Yard. Isn't the serial killer involved in devil worship supposed to be handed over to the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, or the machinery hive mind? All the police department needs to do is send a few assistants, so why would they need to seek the help of a private detective? Yes, the 11 serial murders must have caused a sensation. Civilau's Yard is under a lot of pressure, and they aren't willing to just wait in misery. Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind, but on the surface, he revealed a smile. All right. He boarded Isengard Stanton's rented carriage and saw a young man with brown hair inside. "This is my assistant, Isengard," who had a thin and angular face, introduced. "Please, have a seat." He didn't close the carriage's door, nor did he let the carriage driver drive the horse forward to show that he meant no harm. Klein deliberately sat down uneasily and asked worriedly, "What would you like to talk about, Mr. Stanton?" Isengard took out a dark pipe and said, "I want to know what you've learned from following Ma'am Lopez. Did you hear or discover anything?" "I'm also a detective, and you should know that we have confidentiality agreements in this business," Klein deliberately replied as though he was in a dilemma. "I'm asking you on behalf of Civilau's Yard. This has nothing to do with a confidentiality agreement." Isengard rubbed the pipe with his thumb. A pound, How about 2 pounds? Having learned a lesson from the previous incident with Massault, together with the fact that there was no need to keep it a secret, Klein replied without hesitation, sure. All right. Isengard smiled and took out 2 one-pound notes from his pocket. Klein acted as though he was recalling something before frankly saying, we only heard one sentence. Ma'am. Lopez attempted to order her subordinates to tell Capim that he's not to send anyone over in the next few days. Capim? Isengard nodded, seemingly enlightened. Got it. You know Capim? Klein didn't hide his surprise. Isengard handed the notes over and said with a faint smile, he's one of the most controversial magnates in Sherwood Borough. In Backlund, innocent girls often go missing along deserted streets, and after a long time, they might be chanced upon in all sorts of legal or illegal brothels. A lot of rumors point to Capim as the criminal honcho filled with blood and filth on his hands, but due to a lack of evidence, he remains free to this date. Furthermore, he knows a lot of important people. If that's true, then this fellow should die 1,000 times over. Klein nodded, sighed, and said, this is Lone, this is Backlund, Mr. Stanton, I shall bid you farewell.
Thank you for your cooperation. Isengard got up midway as a polite gesture to send him off. By the way, your fighting skills are excellent. Maybe we'll have a chance to work together in the future. How should I address you? Sherlock Moriarty, Klein answered briefly and got off the carriage. Only when he boarded a newly arrived tracked carriage did Isengard Stanton instruct his assistant to close the door and order the carriage driver to head towards Hillston Borough. Turning his head to the side, he looked out of the window. The gray-haired elderly gentleman had put away his dark pipe, pulled out a brass ornament from his pocket, slowly stroking it in his hand. The brass ornament was a pocket-sized open book with a vertical eye in the center. The appearance and get-up of Mr. Moriarty from just now were a bit out of place. He wore very cultured gold-rimmed glasses, but he had deliberately grown a beard around his mouth, making him look crude and barbaric. This is not quite in line with the norm. In this day and age, people who wear gold-rimmed glasses tend to care a lot about their image, the image of having knowledge and bearing. Maybe he's trying to hide something. Of course, it's also possible that he's a gentleman with an unusual aesthetic sense. Isengard seemed to be talking to himself, but he also seemed to be teaching his assistant. At that moment, Klein, who was sitting on the carriage, mumbled to himself silently as he leaned against the wall, that Detective Isengard Stanton is problematic. Ever since I activated my spirit vision, he had a blue color of rational thought and indifference and maintained a purple color of spirituality dominance. There weren't many other colors of emotion appearing. For normal people, unless they're wholeheartedly focused on studying a difficult problem, it's very difficult to maintain similar states for extended periods of time. Other emotions will inevitably appear, the difference being the issue of how long they can remain in that state. Yes. Either Detective Isengard Stanton is one such genius at observation and reasoning with extraordinary talent, or he's a beyonder. The tracked public carriage had 2 floors as it ferried more than 40 passengers towards the Backlund Bridge area. Klein gradually reined in his thoughts and cast his gaze out the window and admired the 2 to 3-story buildings on the other side of the road. Occasionally he could see brown houses 5 or 6 stories high, a sign of Backlund's latest trend and of the kingdom's most advanced construction technology. After a transfer, Klein arrived at Iron Gate Street and got off the carriage opposite the Bravehearts bar. As it wasn't the peak period at the bar yet, the moment he entered, he saw Caspers drinking at the bar. The old man with the brandy nose had requested for a glass of Langsky Proof, his eyes narrowed in satisfaction as he savored the fragrance of the malt and the burning sensation in his throat. Klein moved closer, rapped the counter, and asked with a smile, "Is Merrick here?" At the same time, he had one hand in his pocket as he gripped Azek's copper whistle, using his spirituality to shield its negative effects. Before he finished his sentence, he felt gazes sweep past him. It was evident that they were observing him. By the time he finished asking his question, the gazes moved away from him and focused on Caspers. The old man with the huge scar on his face opened his eyes, and when he saw that it was Klein, he said in a bad mood, "He didn't come. He didn't come yesterday either. He didn't come." Klein let out a breath of relief, no longer using his spirituality to rap Isaac's copper whistle. When I mentioned Merrick, someone looked at me. When they heard that I was asking him for his whereabouts, the gaze shifted again. Someone is also looking for Merrick. Klein resisted the urge to turn around and observe as he analyzed the abnormality. Combined with an original doubt of his, he felt that the question now had a general answer to it. "I was puzzled last week, why would a Sequence 5 Miss Bodyguard accept a 3-day protection mission for £1,000? This isn't to say that the price is too low, but rather that someone of that level already counts as a powerful person. In the Church of the Goddess, she's qualified to be a Nighthawk deacon or a diocese bishop. If she can gain the favor of a holy artifact, she can even compete for the position of an archbishop or a high-ranking deacon. Among the various secret organizations and intelligence agencies, Sequence 5 also implies that the person would be the person in charge of a borough or at least the number 2 or 3. Even if it were a Beyonder who isn't a part of any organization, a person with such strength would be able to establish a small organization of their own. No matter which point of view it was from, Miss Bodyguard could enjoy tributes from her subordinates, so there was no need for her to personally take the job. At the time, I thought that I had most likely hired a Sequence 6 security guard, who would be able to last a little longer against the expert sent by Bakerland, creating a chance for me, but who knew that Miss Bodyguard would be so terrifyingly strong? Judging from today's events, Miss Bodyguard and Merrick are probably similar to me. Their identities are sensitive, and they have to hide away. Yes, their situation might be even worse, and they have to constantly worry about being hunted down. To be able to hunt Miss Bodyguard, even if that organization doesn't have any high-sequence Beyonders, they must have some holy artifacts or multiple Sequence 5 members. Of course, this is just my hunch. Perhaps it has to do with the exposure of Merrick as a Beyonder and he's now targeted by the Machinery Hive Mind Squad. After some thought, Klein said with regret, "Is that so? I was planning on playing cards with him." Upon hearing something that didn't match Klein's usual manner of speech, Kaspers was alarmed. He didn't look around either, but chortled and said, "I'll be having a card game tonight. Texas, do you want to join in?" "No, I just want to play till dinner." "Sigh, I think I'll just head home." Klein sighed and left the Bravehearts bar without even ordering anything to drink. He had intended to ask Kaspers about other Beyonder gatherings, but in that situation, he carefully abandoned the idea. In fact, he could have gone to a card room or some relatively sealed area to talk with Kaspers, but just to be safe, he decided to wait until next time. Klein was in no hurry to return home. Instead, he went to the one-bedroom apartment he rented in Eastborough and started divining above the gray fog to confirm that no one was following him. After easing his mind, he reached Minsk Street before it was completely dark and found all sorts of subscribed newspapers crammed into his mailbox. "I was in a hurry to leave today, so I didn't even have time to read it. At the Quelag Club, I had a good meal after shooting practice and took a nap, before being forced to play a few tennis matches with Talim. My skills aren't good enough, but my physical fitness can make up for that." He mumbled silently as he opened the door and went inside before twisting the gas lock. He brought the newspapers into the living room and sat on the sofa. He lit the wall lamp and started reading. Klein first read through the Backlund Morning Post and immediately flipped to the 5th page and saw an advertisement. It was an advertisement for the Ernst firm's purchase of goods. The prices were 7 pence per liter of flour, 1 solely of butter, 6 pence per pound of lard, 1 solely 3 pence per pound of cream, 8 solely per pound of Marquis black tea. In other words, there would be a Beyonder gathering in the same place at 8 in the evening tomorrow. The code to the door is to knock 7 times heavily, 1 time lightly, 6 long intervals, and 1 short interval in that order. The remaining 3 and 8 are meaningless. Klein interpreted the content, leaned back against the sofa, and began to look forward to the gathering tomorrow evening. He wanted to sell some formulas to see if he could buy the corresponding ingredients or items. Chapter 273, Handing Out a Formula Wednesday Night, 5 minutes to 8. In an alley behind Braveheart's bar. Klein circled around for a while based on his memories before finally finding the house with the dark candlelights. He was disguised today in a grayish-blue worker's uniform, cap, and a beard so that no one would connect him to the guy who had tried his luck by buying Black Snake's item. It would be best if Eye of Wisdom and the apothecary don't recognize me. Otherwise, a newbie who had relied on luck to become a Beyonder and was able to come up with several potions after a week would definitely be suspicious. Klein put his hands in his pockets and felt for Azek's copper whistle, the ordinary tarot cards, and the charms he had replenished. His uniform was specially modified by a tailor. There were many small pockets with metal bottles filled with herbs powder and extract essence. After taking a deep breath and slowly exhaling, Klein took out the metal mask that could only cover half his face and finished the first step to his disguise. Following that, he used the clown's ability to control his facial expression and his physical tics, as well as his gait while numbing his facial nerves. He wanted to be vastly different from his previous self. However, I'm not sure what Eye of Wisdom relies on to recognize people. This is all I can do. Sigh, if only I was already a faceless. But if that's the case, I wouldn't need to join such low-level Beyonder gatherings. Klein stood outside the door in silence for a few seconds. He then raised his right hand and knocked on the door, 7 hard knocks and 1 light one, with 6 long pauses and 1 short pause in between. Almost without waiting, the small wooden board on the door was silently pulled open, and an eye appeared behind it. It examined the visitor from head to toe. 2 or 3 seconds later, the door creaked open and Eye of Wisdom's attendant handed a hooded black robe to Klein. Klein maintained his emotionless state as he quickly put on the robe and pulled down his hood, letting the shadows cover his face. On the way to the living room, he deliberately took steps he wasn't used to and tried his hardest to eliminate the awkwardness. There was only 1 candle in the dark and silent room and quite a number of members at the gathering. Klein didn't choose a corner like the previous time. Instead, he sat on a high stool right in the center. In short, he wanted everything about his external appearance and behavior to be completely different from the previous 2 times. And it was precisely due to his identity as a clown that gave him this domain of expertise, allowing him to reflect his own body into his mind and gain fundamental control over it. The living room was so silent that it appeared frozen. Time passed by, and finally, Eye of Wisdom looked at the clock on the wall and said in his ancient voice, "It's time. Let's begin. We don't need to wait for our late friends." Just as he finished his sentence, Klein immediately said with a hoarse voice, "I want to sell potion formulas. They are sequence 9 barred and sequence 8 light suppliant from the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sunday. The former is £220 and the latter is £450. This was the most suitable plan that he could come up with after much consideration. The Spectator and the Telepathist potions were related to the Psychology Alchemists, a secret organization that was still active in Backlund in the Lone Kingdom. If he recklessly produced them, he might attract their attention. And the Church of Eternal Blazing Sun was blocked out by the Church of the Lord of Storms, so the corresponding Beyonders rarely appeared in Backlund and could do very little. Therefore, it was an extremely safe choice. The potion of the Seer pathway involved Klein himself, and he certainly didn't want to reveal his characteristics. After having experienced so many battles and watched so many battles with Beyonders, he gradually came to understand something. It was that below the high sequences, Beyonders of different pathways had their own characteristics which didn't overlap. That was to say, each of them had their own strengths and weaknesses, and their strengths and weaknesses were all very obvious. The strengths were indeed strong, and the weaknesses were indeed weak. For example, the Spectator pathway lacked the ability to fight in actual combat, but if they were ignored and were unconsciously misled, then no matter how strong an opponent's combat skills were, it was possible for them to die without knowing why. A clear example would be Hurricane Rear Admiral Kalangos, who clearly possessed the mystical item, Creeping Hunger, and had an overall combat strength of a Sequence 5, but he still died in a rather inexplicable manner. Most of this was thanks to Azek, but one couldn't dismiss the role of the spectator. Due to the fact that the majority of the Beyonder jobs below the high sequence had distinct characteristics and obvious weaknesses with weak bodies, if one could conceal one's strengths and understand the situation of their enemies beforehand, it wasn't impossible for them to defeat someone stronger. In extreme cases, there was still a very small chance of a Sequence 9 killing a Sequence 5. Of course, this was a perfect hypothesis, but in reality, it was almost impossible. Sequence 5 was already considered strong, and the corresponding Beyonder powers could be considered miraculous. Strengths could effectively cover up weaknesses, but before reaching Sequence 6, it was very difficult to cause any effect on them. On the other hand, many of the Beyonders below high sequences were very afraid of being attacked by a group, even if their opponents were all below their own sequence. This was because once one became flustered, their attempts to avoid a fault would lead to failure of another. Their weaknesses could lead to fatal outcomes. These problems were why shepherds were ranked first below high sequences. They were so all-round that if they combined and matched their Beyonder powers well enough, they would almost have zero shortcomings. After I advance to the Sequence 7, I'll have all sorts of magical Beyonder powers. Then, even if I encounter a Sequence 6, I'll be able to contend against them for a while, and I might even be able to win. If I encounter a Sequence 5, there might still be a chance of escaping. As his thoughts raced, Klein looked around, waiting for someone to speak. If Bard and Light Suppliant can't be sold, then I can only go for second best and consider selling Spectator and Telepathist. In consideration of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility and conservation. The formula of my own pathway definitely shouldn't be sold. The witch pathway wouldn't as well, for it would lead to many tragic cases. Whether it's instigator or witch, they're the type that necessitates committing evil deeds. Klein was a little nervous, but his face remained expressionless as he waited. Actually, I can consider buying it. At that moment, the chubby apothecary laughed. I can also accept another apprentice and give him these two formulas, making him specialize in praying for light to shine on my herbs. Perfect. How extravagant. His words broke the momentary silence in the room. A man in the corner, who had his hood pulled very low, spoke in a deliberately sharp voice, perhaps I can give it to my child. At least it's stronger than my sequence. Sequence 9, 200 pounds, Sequence 8, 400 pounds, if you agree, we have a deal. To be able to take out 600 pounds at one go means he's quite rich. That's enough to buy a house in Tinjin City. Klein pretended to think, looked at the other members at the gathering, and observed their reactions. Noticing that no one had the urge to raise the price, and that the other party's bid had reached his bottom line, Klein thought for a while and said, I'll tag on an additional request. You cannot sell these two formulas in this gathering, but you are free to do as you wish elsewhere. The man said sharply, all right, Mr. Eye of Wisdom will bear witness. Klein didn't know how to prove that the formula was real, but he didn't want to ask as it would expose the fact that he hadn't participated in many gatherings. Therefore, he silently pulled up his robe and took out the two potion formulas he had written long ago and handed it to an attendant beside him. The attendant didn't walk to the corner. Instead, he went to the single sofa in the center and handed the folded paper over to the Eye of Wisdom. The old gentleman spread out the paper and, without taking an extra look at it, placed it on a small round table beside him. Then, he took out a handkerchief and wiped his right palm. From his pocket, he took out a ring inlaid with many tiny diamonds. This ring was complicated and exquisite in design. In the middle of the ring was a dark green gem that looked like an eye. Just by looking at it from a distance, Klein felt his head swell and his body turn uncomfortable. It was just like back when he was taking his math examination. Eye of Wisdom solemnly wore the ring on his right middle finger and then closed his eyes, as if he was preparing something. Suddenly, the emerald green gem on the ring bloomed with a resplendent golden color which was as bright as the sun. Eye of Wisdom quickly extended his right hand and let the gem touch the potion formula written by Klein. The rays of golden light became purer until they eventually turned into a holographic projection. Authentic and effective. Eye of Wisdom announced in a low voice. He immediately removed the ring from his finger, not daring to wear it for another second. His tone sounds just like a notary. That ring is the most prized item in Mr. Eye of Wisdom's collection, sealed artifact 2-081. It emulates the powers of a notary. Klein watched on thoughtfully, feeling a little covetous. After the notarization, the deal was quickly concluded, and Klein received a thick wad of cash, all in 10-pound notes. After counting the bills 3 times, he didn't fold and put them in his pocket. Instead, he held them in the palm of his hand and waited for an opportunity to spend them. He planned on observing for a moment to ensure that there was nothing he needed before speaking again to mention his desire to purchase things. At that moment, the apothecary looked around and said, "I brought a few bottles of sedatives." He really brought it? I've already forgotten all about it. In order to be different from his past self, Klein could only pretend that he wasn't around. After shouting a few times and seeing that there was no response, the apothecary muttered, "That guy didn't come this time. Maybe he's dead somewhere. Thank you for your blessings. But it's delightful that you failed to recognize me." Klein heaved a sigh of relief. The apothecary habitually asked for Spring of the Elves marrow crystals again, but it was in vain as usual. Moments after he shut up, a woman whose face was completely shrouded by her hood said with 2 boxes at her feet, "I have 2 weapons with beyonder effects. This must be the lady who sold the inscribed steel sword the last time, right? My spirituality instincts as a seer tells me that she has another 2 similar weapons. Backing her is some beyonder armament organization, right? Well, maybe she has an artisan behind her, also known as Sequence 6 of the Machinery Specialist and Savant Pathway." Klein looked over with anticipation. He had agreed to give the son a beyonder weapon worth 500 to 700 pounds, which could effectively his combat ability. He didn't promise the specific type and characteristics, so long as it was similar and could be used, he could buy it. In any case, the son wasn't picky about it. The woman emphasized the word, collect. "All right, friends who are willing to buy one of these weapons, please make a bid." Before Klein could even speak, he heard a male voice from the long sofa. "Axe of Hurricane, 520 pounds. The woman waited a few seconds before asking again, "Is there anyone else who wants to bid?" 530 pounds. Klein added 10 pounds. The man immediately replied, 550 pounds. "This little son, if he raises it to more than 600 pounds, I won't be buying it. I'll get you a new whip." With a definite strategy in mind, Klein called out very calmly, 560 pounds. He tried to make it appear that no matter what offer was made, he could add on an additional 10 pounds. And the 600 pounds he had just earned was just enough to put invisible pressure on the other party. Upon hearing the latest price, the man fell silent and shrugged. "All right then, it's yours." Phew. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. "Is there anyone else who wants to bid for the Axe of Hurricane?" the woman asked again, but the room was silent. "Sold." The lady didn't hesitate any longer and handed the box next to her right foot to the attendant. The attendant had the Eye of Wisdom appraise it before bringing it to Klein. Money was handed over in exchange for the item. Putting away the remaining 4 10-pound notes, Klein opened the box and saw an axe that could be attached to one's back or tucked in one's belt. Its entire body was iron black in color, thick and sturdy, with a sharp edge. In his spirit vision, it was clear that the creator had used a large number of spiritual materials. There were also many symbols and magic runes on the surface of the axe. They were embedded inside, turning into lightning and hurricane patterns. When Klein reached out to touch it, he felt a faint pricking pain. He nodded and placed the box on his lap. It can be exchanged for the true root and juice of a miscreant. My magician potion is only missing the spinal fluid of a dark-patterned Black Panther. I've made a good deal of money in my past few commissions, and together with my original savings and what I just have left, I have £209, 5 solis and 5 pennies on me. The Beyonder ingredients corresponding to sequence 7 are valued at £500 to £700. I still had to sell formulas or knowledge. Yes, I'll take the time to check on Leopard this week and confirm the progress of his bicycle. Klein stopped bidding and quietly watched from the sidelines. Later on, someone bought the Whip of Slowness for £480, and a Beyonder ingredient called Heart of Featherman wasn't sold because its price reached £1,600 and nobody wanted it. According to his knowledge of mysticism, Klein knew that this Beyonder ingredient would be classified in the category of sequence 6. In the following transactions, more failed than succeeded. After all, most of the Beyonders who came to the gathering had a specific purpose, and they wouldn't casually waste money and resources. They weren't like Klein, who bought any weapon as long as the Beyonder effects were good enough. I want to sell a formula potion. Sequence 9, Corpse Collector. £230. Towards the end, a man sitting quietly in a corner said with a deep voice. Corpse Collector. I remember that this potion formula can only be found in the Church of the Evernight Goddess, Church of the God of Combat, and the Numinous Episcopate. Has an undercover Nighthawk sneaked in, or is he a member of the Numinous Episcopate who's trying to revive death? Of course, it isn't that strange for low-sequence formulas to be found in the wild. This isn't a huge secret. I remember old Neil mentioning that the formula for Corpse Collector involved a desiccated black-spotted frog. Klein controlled himself and didn't smile. He thoughtfully looked ahead and discovered that the potion formula of Corpse Collector was quickly sold. The potion formula for sequence 9 is very easy to sell. Before, there was just a single sequence 8 Folk of Rage formula that failed to close several times, while my light suppliant formula matched with sequence 9 Bard was sold relatively easily. Yes, most Beyonders would collect sequence 9 formulas if they have the money to spare. They can give their own children and students more opportunities to choose from, allowing them to walk a path that they preferred. Under this premise, if a sequence 8 formula doesn't have the foundation sequence 9, they would have to wait for Beyonders who are attempting to advance, and there might not even be one in 1 to 2 years. After all, the circle of Beyonders is very scattered, and most people don't know about the acting method. Yes, they also don't know the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. Klein silently thought and didn't speak. After another 15 minutes, seeing that the gathering was about to end, he asked probingly, who has the complete spinal fluid of a dark-patterned Black Panther? Silence. No one spoke in the living room. Klein thought for a moment, then added, I will provide payment that no Beyonder would refuse. For example, the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. Unfortunately, I've already sworn to the goddess that I wouldn't impart the acting method to anyone else. I've already died once. I wonder if that oath is invalid. Klein forcefully retracted his scattered thoughts, but he still didn't hear anyone speak. Okay, next. He deliberately made a shrug that he wouldn't normally do. The apothecary cleared his throat and said, I've brought quite a few of my own medicine. Take a look at what you want. It's not expensive at all. It's just a few pounds or even a few soli. When the lady selling Beyonder weapons heard this, she asked curiously, I want to know if the dangerous beast in the sewers has been eliminated. The apothecary snorted immediately. You asked the right person. After saying that, he spread out his hands. I don't know either. After I got someone to make a police report, I haven't been to the sewers ever since. Bro, you're asking for a beating. It must have been hard for you to grow up so healthily. From the looks of it, it was very wise of you to choose the apothecary job. Klein couldn't help but lampoon in Chinese. The woman took a deep breath and slowly exhaled without saying a word. When all the strange medicine the apothecary had brought were sold, Eye of Wisdom announced that the gathering was over. He delegated Klein to be fifth to leave, through a secret passage in the basement. From the looks of it, Eye of Wisdom didn't recognize me either. With some relief, Klein took off his hooded robe and tossed it to the attendant. Then, he walked out of the passage and skillfully circled around it. After confirming that no one was following him, he took off his iron mask, left the secluded street, took the box containing the axe of Hurricane, and headed straight to East Borough. There were no gas lamps on Black Palm Street in East Borough, and after dark, it was like an abyss. In a particular apartment here, Klein sealed the room with a wall of spirituality, then he summoned himself and carried the axe of Hurricane above the grey fog. If it had been a little heavier, I wouldn't have been able to carry it with me even if I had Mr. Azek's copper whistle to reinforce my spirit. Then, I would have to switch to a sacrificial ritual. Klein mumbled, sending his thoughts to the illusory star corresponding to the sun. The world has sacrificed the weapon to me. You can prepare the bestowment ritual. City of Silver. Upon seeing the grey fog and hearing Mr. Fool's instructions, Derek Berg immediately sat up and rushed to prepare. Before holding the bestowment ceremony, he silently took out his knight's sword and made a few vertical slashes to ease his anticipation. Would it be a straight sword, a broadsword, or a rapier? Derek stopped without realizing, unable to stop himself from thinking, and subconsciously pictured himself using that powerful weapon. After a while, during the ritual, he saw the beyonder weapon that belonged to him. It was an axe. Chapter 275, Pound Family. Dear Mr. Fool, please tell Mr. World that I'll try to gather the Mist Trent's true root and juice as soon as possible. After receiving the son's reply, Klein nodded indiscernibly and muttered to himself, from the looks of it, he's rather satisfied with the weapon. Even without the additional effects from the environment, the axe of Hurricane is still quite a formidable weapon. He had passed the information regarding the beyonder weapon's characteristics and limitations to the son. He didn't describe it directly in order to avoid sounding naggy. He needed to maintain his image. After doing all of this, Klein didn't stay any longer and immediately returned to the real world, changed his clothes, and left Black Palm Street. East Borough, Dharavi Street, in a cramped but lively pub. Zio Dericha covered her nose and mouth as she squeezed in. To her, what was bad about this place wasn't just because it smelled of alcohol and sweat, but that she would easily encounter people much taller than she was. She had to face their armpits and the strong odor was nauseating. Using a great deal of effort and even using the powers of an arbiter, Zio finally squeezed her way to the bar counter and saw the man she was looking for. It was a young man in his 20s. He had a face as long and thin as a horse. His eyebrows were messy and ferocious, but his facial features were relatively soft. He was gulping down alcohol and laughing loudly with the patrons around him. Williams, I have something to talk to you about. Zio banged on the wooden counter. This boorish action immediately attracted many angry gazes. However, they quickly retreated under the stern gaze of an arbiter. Oh, Zio, I haven't seen you in days. Let me see, it's been a week, no, at least 3 weeks. Care for a drink? Half and half. Williams said, half drunk and half surprised. Half and Half was one of the most popular alcoholic beverages in East Borough, made from malt beer and fortified grape wine, and because it has precisely made up of 2 constituents of equal proportion, it was known as Half and Half. Are you really going to let me drink? Zio pricked up her brows. No, he doesn't, the boss, who was wiping the glasses, hurriedly answered on Williams's behalf. He clearly remembered how deadly the girl would become when she got drunk. She would use her fists to persuade the guests to quit drinking and throw them out one by one. The corner of Williams's mouth twitched as he spread out his hands and said, Go on, why are you looking for me? He was one of East Borough's informants and was connected to several gangs. Zio frowned and said, Williams, can't you quit drinking? Save your money, marry a nice girl, and come home every day to hot water, food, and warm greetings. You can share all the things you've seen in the day with her, and she can tell you about the trivial things that happened in your house, and there will be cute kids who will kiss you on the cheek and play around you. Isn't such warmth nice? She was able to gain a quick foothold in Backland's East Borough, all thanks to Williams's help, so she had always wanted him to be better off. Warmth? William scoffed. It's built on the money I bring back, and I've seen through the farce. If I could bring home 20 soldi a week, I'm sure my family would be warm and just as you described it to be, but if not, Lord, the screams and insults from the woman, the cries and shrieks of children, would drive me crazy. My mom is a good example. Every time my old man comes home, he'll beat me up and make a ruckus, so if that's the case, I might as well use the soldi and the pence on me to trade for drinks. No one cares how much I earn here, everyone drinks and chats, and the mood is really good. If I want women, there are cute street girls outside. They wouldn't quarrel with you. Zio smirked and said, you really are an incorrigible believer of the Lord of Storms. One day, you'll die from alcoholism or some strange disease. At least I've enjoyed life, Williams replied without minding what she said. I haven't worked in almost 3 days, so I'm not going to give you a discount. Zio stopped persuading him. She stroked her short, disheveled blonde hair and handed him the portrait of Lenivis that Audrey had given her. Help me keep an eye out for this man. Find him as soon as possible. Here are different portraits of him. William spread out the piece of paper in his stupor and glanced at it before skiing. He looks too ordinary, and there are so many people in East Borough. There are people who die at any moment. Some leave, some come, and others become vagrants. It'll be difficult to find him. In short, help me keep an eye out. Notify me immediately if you find anyone who looks like him. Zio took out a 5 soldi bill and handed it to him. Here's some beer money. If you can find the person in the portrait, I'll, give you another £10. £10? Williams whistled. Zio, when did you become so generous? Or is this person worth more? That's how much his reward is worth. £10 for providing clues. Zio pretended to look around the pub and answered, don't forget about this matter, I'll come back in a few days' time. She had already run through nearly half of East Borough and issued the mission to the gang leaders and informants she knew, and she had paid several pounds in advance. As long one of them succeeds, I'll earn it all back. All those profits. Zio silently cheered herself on and walked out of the pub with her nose and mouth covered. At that moment, the scene gradually turned chaotic due to some conflict between a few drunkards. Zio glanced over in exasperation, then raised her voice and shouted, "Stop!" A sense of dominance reverberated within the pub, and it was as though the drunkards had met their nemesis as they hurriedly sat down. Some of them even hugged their heads and squatted on the ground. Phew, I wonder when I'll advance to sheriff. Zio sighed, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. On Thursday morning, Klein took the long trip to St. George Borough, which was like another city altogether, to show some concern for his first investment. With his last tip and the revelation from Roselle's manuscript, Leopard was progressing very quickly on the bicycle project and had already built a crude prototype. This was very much in line with Klein's impression of bicycles. After a trial ride, Klein offered a few suggestions for improvements, saying he would disburse the second investment payment next week, and expressed his hope of bringing in new investors as soon as possible, so that the project could enter an industrial phase. The only problem was that Leopard believed that he was the inventor and had the right to name the product. He wasn't satisfied with the term bicycle and intended to adopt the more popular term bike. Klein didn't care. At noon, he returned to 15 Minsk Street, but before he could take off his hat, he heard a series of illusory pleas. Miss Justice. She has collected the information on the abject nobles so quickly. Still in thought, Klein prepared to enter the living room and head to the second floor. At that moment he heard the doorbell, and when he opened the door, he saw Julianne, the maid from the Sammers next door. Mr. Moriarty, Mrs. Sammer would like to invite you to a Sunday luncheon. There will be a lot of neighbors attending, the maid said as if she was reciting something. After his return last night, Klein had handed the portable camera to Mrs. Sammer and exchanged a few words with her, but he hadn't received any indication of a luncheon. That's right, according to the magazines, the middle class wouldn't invite anyone to an event in person, but instead, they formally sent their servants or maids to send the invitation. This is in line with Mrs. Sammer's style. Klein was puzzled at first before he immediately came to a realization, so he promised to punctually attend on Sunday. Who wouldn't want to have a free lunch? And Mr. and Mrs. Sammer aren't very difficult people to get along with, as long as you don't mind their showing off. Klein secretly added in his heart. He watched as Julianne left. He closed the door behind him and walked toward the stairs, his eyes scanning the slightly messy living room, dining room, and kitchen. It's been a few days since I've cleaned up. I'm a bachelor, so it's not bad that I'm able to maintain a level of tidiness such as this. I have too many secrets, and I might even suffer an attack. It's not too good to just hire an in-house maidservant for chores. Yes. I should discuss this with Mrs. Sammer on Sunday and ask her to send her maid to clean up twice a week, and I'll pay for it. Many tenants and landlords have had similar agreements. Klein calmly walked into the bedroom on the second floor and drew the curtains. After entering the fog, he found that the prayer had indeed come from Miss Justice. This girl of blue blood sat on a piano stool, her hands on the keys. She wasn't playing the piano, instead, she was whispering the honorific name of the fool that doesn't belong to this era. I've gathered the information regarding the abject nobles. I'm requesting permission to hold a sacrificial ritual and seek your help in passing it to Mr. World. That's quick, as expected of a professional. Klein immediately responded. Audrey, who had just returned from the Royal Coat of Arms office and experts in this field, completed the sacrificial ritual with a little unfamiliarity as she threw the thick manuscript into the illusory door. I'll pass it to the World. Klein's tone was indifferent as he cut off the connection. This time, he was in no hurry to return to the real world. Instead, he flipped through the manuscript and found the part pertaining to the Pound family. The Pound family had indeed obtained the title of Viscount from the Battle of the Violated Oath. After that, they were loyal to the royal family, and they had quite a bit of power in the army and their own fiefdom. However, 32 years ago, two of the family's heirs died from serious illnesses, one after another. At that time, the old Viscount had no choice but to bring the child of a distant relative home. Not long after, the old Viscount passed away. As the child was still young, under the enticement and instigation of the servants, he changed the butler and turned foppish. In just 8 years he had lost most of his fortune and was reduced to a baron. Even the family's house in Backlund was sold. In the years that followed, his title was reduced once again to that of a baronet. Died of serious illnesses? Their corpses are probably nowhere to be found. They should all be in that innermost room in the underground structure, outside that bloody door. The old Viscount must have deliberately concealed the matter, preventing the royal family, military or churches to investigate. From the looks of it, the Pound family must have discovered the underground structure from the Fourth Epoch about 30 years ago. Perhaps, the underground secret door was built by them, but there are more than 2 corpses in that room. There were others who had entered in ancient times to probe the area. Well, I'll have to talk to Baronet Pound in a way that won't reveal my identity. Klein stopped thinking and looked at the last paragraph. He saw what he wanted, Baronet Pound, currently living at 29 Civilouse Street, Empress Borough. Chapter 276, Rafter Pound's Civilouse Prefecture was located west of the Lone Kingdom, across the Hornacis mountain range from the Intis Republic. And in Backlund, there was a street named after it, on the edge of Empress Borough, where the headquarters of the capital's police department was located. Many people chose to settle down here for the peace of mind, and Rafter Pound was one of them. The baronet stood by the closed window in his warm activity room at Unit 29, in his cotton-quilted pajamas, staring diagonally across the street at Civilau's yard. He was in his early 40s, but the sides of his hair had turned white. He had puffy eyes and clear wrinkles on his face. His body constantly emitted the smell of alcohol. On the floor behind Rafter lay some torn lingerie, and opposite it was a burning fireplace. The baronet raised his glass and gulped the rest of the liquid in it. Then, he walked slowly to the door and returned to his bedroom to get some sleep. As there was no pipe to transfer the heat from the fireplace, he felt the bone-chilling chill of late autumn as soon as he left the activity room. Damn it! Rafter Pound cursed under his breath as he staggered to the bedroom door and twisted the handle. The bedroom was dark, with only a faint crimson glow shining in. Rafter was about to close the door behind him and collapse into bed when his eyes suddenly froze. A figure was sitting quietly on a chair beside the curtain. The figure wore a pair of grayish-blue pants and a cap. The entire person was completely hidden in the shadows. Sensing Baronet Pound's gaze, the man slowly raised his head and looked over. His face was painted red, yellow, and white, looking like the funniest clown. Rafter was about to shout and run when he saw a revolver aimed at him and heard two deep and hoarse sentences. "I advise you not to do anything unwise. If you cooperate, I won't harm you, and I won't take away your belongings, if you still have any left." Rafter Pound's expression changed a few times, and he very obediently closed the bedroom door. Then, he half raised his hands and sat on the edge of the bed. What do you want from me?" He hiccuped in his drunken stupor, and his body trembled slightly as he reminded, "Civilau's yard is just across the street." "I know, but I think I'm closer to you than you are to Civilau's yard." Disguised as a clown, Klein had changed his voice and tone as he warned, "And my purpose is just to ask you a few questions." Before he came to Civilau's street, he had divined if there would be any danger in making this trip in the mysterious space above the gray fog and had obtained an answer that it was very safe. "Questions?" Rafter's lips trembled as laughed bitterly, "Here we go again. Am I never going to escape this nightmare? Have there been many people coming to you with questions?" Klein continued the topic. "No, not only questions. After my uncle, the Honorable Old Viscount, passed away, too many things have happened to me. The amiable old butler resigned for no reason and has vanished. Those servants and maids would change one after the other without warning, becoming unfamiliar and cold. They were looking for something, yes, they were looking for something, I wasn't even 10 back then. All I could do was watch, and I didn't dare tell anyone. I was afraid that I would never wake up again." Rafter replied as though he was on the brink of collapse. "Looking for something? Were they searching for the underground structure, or the treasures of the Pound family, such as the Beyonder characteristics and mystical items buried near the evil spirit? The royal family and the churches must have realized this, as the higher-ups must know about the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. Since the Pound family was in ruins, these things should have been taken back, right? Unless the old Viscount paid a huge price and bought some other rare Beyonder characteristics and mystical items of the same sequence to conceal the matter of the underground structure." After Klein finished listening quietly, he generated many guesses. He seemed relaxed, but in reality, he could attack at any time. "How long has this been going on for?" I don't know. There are faces around me that I don't know. How can I be sure that the remaining people aren't also in cahoots?" "Ha, I pretended not to notice anything. After trembling for a few years, I was enticed by them to do drinking, sex, gambling, smoking marijuana, and all sorts of things that make me look like a piece of trash." Rafter Pound gave a somewhat crazy laugh. "They're finally relieved and are no longer watching me. When I sold that house, whoosh. All of them left, with no idea where they went. No, they must still be secretly monitoring me, preventing me from calling the police." "Right, they aren't letting me call the police. This fellow has some mental illness. I have no idea if what he said is true or false. In his aura, the change in his mood colors adhere to logic, but what if he just feels that he had let down the old Viscount and fantasized a whole sequence of events like this to find an excuse for his degeneration? Later, he would keep telling himself that until he's utterly convinced. As a qualified keyboard warrior, Klein, who knew a little of everything, had seen similar cases in his previous life. After thinking for 2 seconds, he asked, "What did these people ask you?" "They asked me how the 2 children of the old Viscount died. They asked me what abnormal behavior the old Viscount had over the years. I wasn't even 10 years old at the time, so I don't know anything." Rafter waved his arms and growled under his breath. "Calm down, please calm down." Klein lowered his left hand and attempted to confirm if Baronet Pound knew of the underground structure via multiple angles. Meanwhile, they were secretly searching for the secret remains left behind by the Tudor Empire in Backlund. After an unknown period of time, they finally found something. Thus, they bought what currently belongs to Millet Carter's house and built an exaggerated basement, which was used to explore the surrounding area. 30 to 40 years ago, they found the ruins and built a secret door to it. But, during the exploration process, an accident occurred. That evil spirit didn't recognize any of the so-called Tudor descendants at all. The 2 heirs of the old Viscount died in that room, in the deepest corner, one after the other. Even their Beyonder characteristics and mystical items couldn't be retrieved. Although the old Viscount spent a great price to buy similar Beyonder characteristics, making it seem like the 2 heirs had died relatively normal deaths, the consecutive deaths made the royal household and the churches suspicious. Therefore, after the old Viscount passed away, Rafter Pound deliberately exaggerated and distorted the secret investigations of the past, to frighten himself into having mental problems. He began to engage in debauchery so as to avoid the attention of others. This can explain what previously puzzled me. How can a Viscount family be placed under the control of some mysterious person without any action from the royal household and the churches? Even if controlling him was necessary, they would do it in a milder and undetectable manner. For example, using a faceless of my sequence 6 pathway. A child can even sense something abnormal, much less the powerful Beyonders of the royal household and the 3 churches. The reason why they were unaware can only be explained by the fact that they were the ones who had sent those people. Yes. Back then, I surmised that the Tudor family and the Trunsoist family grasped the Dark Emperor pathway, so due to the need to act, they would establish dynasties to maintain the style and uniqueness of the Solomon Empire. On this point, Miss Bodyguard has indirectly proven it. The Dark Emperor pathway's sequence 9 is Lawyer, a Beyonder job that is extremely good at using order. Yes. Rafter Pound was able to deceive my dream and spirit channeling abilities because of this. Perhaps he's gone one step further. He cooperated with me sufficiently, so in his muddled state in the dream, he was still able to subconsciously use the loophole of order and affect the development in the direction he wishes to have. Upon careful consideration, during the process of spirit channeling, Rafter Pound didn't seem to really lie. However, his truth was only a partial truth. Maintain the family, and, remember the glory, can be referring to the Pound family and also the Tudor family. Klein's train of thought became clearer bit by bit, and he had an overall assessment of the situation. From Rafter Pound's current attitude, the evil spirit shouldn't be able to escape without any external help, otherwise, the Baronet would have long thought of a way to save himself. It doesn't matter if the evil spirit would come looking for him, as long as it escapes the seal and creates a disaster, the secret of the underground ruins would be exposed to the royal household and the churches. When that happens, Rafter will definitely be implicated. The room opposite had collapsed, but it didn't affect the power that restricted the evil spirit. This means that as long as the innermost room isn't directly destroyed, the evil spirit wouldn't be able to escape. The plan is clear then. I would buy some explosives from Casper's and collapse the entrance so that no one can get in, leaving the evil spirit buried underground forever. When I'm powerful enough, I can consider finishing it and help the citizens of Backlund get rid of this latent danger and harvest some valuable items in the process. However, how should I collapse it safely? I don't know anything. Maybe Caspers knows a demolition expert. After all, he is a black market weapons merchant. Klein quickly finalized the plan and decided on finding Caspers tomorrow evening. He would try to settle the matter of the underground ruins within the week. As for the true relationship between the Pound family and the Tudor family, and for Rafter's abnormality, he didn't want to probe too deeply into it. It's none of my business. Klein grumbled and quickly plummeted down past the gray fog and returned to the real world. On Friday morning, Klein went out early as usual and pretended to be very busy. The truth was, he had once again gone to the Quelag Club to practice his shooting and read the newspapers. He enjoyed himself quite a bit. At tea time, he was about to leave after staying there the entire day, but he was surprised to see Mary Gale, his former employer, and Talem Dumont, the equestrian teacher, enter the club at the same time. They were accompanied by a number of gentlemen in double-breasted frock coats and beautiful ladies in fine makeup. Among them was the Daily Observer reporter, Mike Joseph. "Oh, Detective Moriarty, what a coincidence." Mike, with his charming eyes but rather rough skin, took the initiative to greet him. Klein smiled and replied, "Mr. Reporter, are you done with your investigative news?" "It's done, thanks to your help. Let me do the introductions. This is the famous detective, Mr. Sherlock Moriarty, a good friend of Talem's." Mike waved his arm and said. After both sides greeted each other, Mike continued, "I've roughly figured out who Capim is. I'll tell you in detail when I have the time. In short, I have every reason to believe that Sibber's death was caused by a copycat killer and not by the serial killer. You will see the news of my investigations on the papers tomorrow." "It's just as I thought." Klein smiled in response.
At that moment, Mike seemed to remember something and turned his head to Mary Gale and said, "I'll make an appointment with you for an interview regarding the air pollution situation in Backlund and its solution. However, you have to communicate with my editor-in-chief in advance to finalize the page and time." Mary's eyes lit up. "All right. Thank you very much. Mike, why didn't I think of such a good idea? This is for the promotion of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. This reporter, Mike, has quite a lot of experience after all. Although the Daily Observer isn't one of the best newspapers, its circulation is considerable. Did Mary suddenly come here today because the other members of the House of Commons who are members of this club were coming? This type of private club is indeed suitable for politics and business." Klein seemed to gain an understanding and bade farewell ahead of time. Before becoming a faceless, he didn't want to get involved in high-level affairs such as this. Evening, in an apartment in East Borough. After a busy day, Williams entered the small room he rented, intending to change his coat, get some money, go to the pub for a drink, and settle his dinner there. In the gloomy darkness, he suddenly stopped putting on his coat. He saw a shadow standing by the window, its face completely obscured by the shadow of the hood. "Who told you to look for Lenivas?" the dark figure asked in a low, slow voice. Williams quickly put on his coat, gulped his saliva, and said, "I have a friend, a bounty hunter." Bounty hunters referred to adventurers who used various bounty rewards as their main source of income. There were a lot of them in East Borough and in Backlund. Why did he suddenly start looking for Lenivas? This is a bounty that was offered a long time ago. The black figure was extremely tall. Step by step, he approached Williams. "I don't know. Maybe she just wanted to attempt another bounty." Williams took a very tiny step back. The dark figure pressed hoarsely, "Who is she?" Williams immediately entered a dilemma, but after a few seconds, he replied with a trembling voice, Zio Dericha. "I don't know where she lives." "Very good, very honest." The black figure reached out and patted Williams's body. Without further ado, he walked towards the door. William secretly heaved a sigh of relief, believing that his rich experience in the underworld had helped him. Don't try to be brave when you shouldn't. At that moment, he saw the shadow snap his fingers. Paw! Williams's thoughts froze, and his body suddenly split into pieces, scattering in all directions, splattering the ground and walls with flesh and blood. Then, the shadow broke the gas pipe. Amidst the sound of gas spewing out from the pipes, he picked up the candle from Williams's desk and struck it against the wick. The black shadow left immediately. A few minutes later, the candle suddenly lit up by itself. Boom! The explosion wiped out everything.
Chapter 278, Free? After dinner, in the billiard room of the Bravehearts bar. Dressed in a simple black coat and a dark cap, Klein held a glass of Southville beer, closed the door behind him, and walked over to Caspers, who was bent over the table, trying to hit the ball. Before he could muster a smile and say hello, Caspers stopped what he was doing, straightened up, and glanced at him. Merrick isn't here. There are no other gatherings you want? I have nothing but weapons. Very familiar with what I want. Fortunately, I have a different goal today. Klein curled the corner of his lips and said, I'm here to buy weapons. Merrick isn't here. From the looks of it, they've been exposed and are targeted by their enemies. They've decided to switch locations. Then I won't be able to contact Miss Bodyguard. And I was planning on tricking Millet Carter with Merrick's zombies as my helpers. They'll keep a secret, they're obedient, and they're unafraid of death. Well, the premise of their obedience is when the influence of Azek's copper whistle is shielded. As he spoke, a series of thoughts flashed through Klein's mind. Caspers was slightly surprised. With a look of suspicion, he leaned against his cue stick and rubbed his brandy nose and said, What kind of weapon are you looking to buy? Have you finished the previous bullets? That's quite a lot of practice. No, I practiced with bullets I bought at the Quelag Club. Klein smiled. I want to buy explosives, the kind that is widely used in mines. What do you want to do? Caspers blurted out as his expression turned solemn and stern. I'm warning you, don't try to do anything condemnable. I won't allow my customers to challenge Civilau's yard. Of course, you don't have to buy weapons from me. To be able to become a black market weapon merchant and live to this day, from a certain point of view, he must abide strictly by the rules. At the very least, he wouldn't sell to those crazy fellows. Klein habitually gave his evaluation from a Nighthawk's point of view and smiled. You seem to have misunderstood something. I'm not going to blast open the door of a bank vault or try to create any sensational news. I'm helping someone with the demolition of a building, making it easier for subsequent renovations. Then why didn't he find a proper construction company? Caspers didn't let down his guard. Haha, that's a secret chamber. He doesn't want others to know about it. Klein switched to asking, Do you know any reliable explosives experts? I'm not very good at this sort of thing, and I'm afraid the whole house will collapse. When Caspers saw that Klein was making considerations to ensure that the house remained in good condition, the doubt in his mind was immediately dispelled quite significantly. Just as he was deliberating for an answer, an illusory voice suddenly rang out in the room. There's no need. A familiar feeling came over Klein.
He quickly turned around and found Miss Bodyguard sitting on a chair in the corner without him realizing it. She was still wearing her black Gothic regal dress and matching soft hat. Her face was as pale as ever, and her blonde hair and delicate features accentuated each other. Good evening, madam. Klein slightly bent his back and bowed. Good evening, ma'am. Sharon. Caspers did the same. So her name is Sharon. Klein thoughtfully waited for her to speak. The lady named Sharon looked at Caspers and said, Merrick won't be coming back here again. If you need him for anything, leave a message according to the third method. Yes, ma'am. Sharon. Caspers, who had clearly seen a lot of things in his life, seemed to have an instinctive fear of Miss Bodyguard. Upon hearing this, Klein interrupted, if I wanted to get Merrick's help, how should I get in touch with him? Through Caspers, Sharon answered simply. All right. Klein spread out his hands and said, oh yeah, what did you mean when you said there's no need for a demolition expert? Sharon's blue eyes didn't waver in the slightest. I am one. You are one. You're a demolition expert. Wait a minute, aren't you a Beyonder with special abilities, probably at sequence 5? Why are you being a part-time demolition expert? Klein froze as he felt at a loss for words. In the end, he chose to believe Miss Bodyguard as he said in deliberation, I'm going to visit. Before he could finish, he looked at Caspers. It was indicative that the ensuing topic wasn't suitable for this ordinary person. Fundamentally, due to his body, a black market weapons dealer is indeed considered an ordinary person. Klein silently added. Sharon looked at Caspers and said, prepare the explosives. £2. He'll pay. Yes, ma'am. Sharon. Caspers glanced at Klein and limped out of the billiard room, not forgetting to close the door behind him. Seeing Miss Bodyguard looking at him silently, Klein felt like he was being watched by a ghost. He quickly organized his words and said, I found Baronet Pound's address and visited him in the middle of the night. After recounting everything that Rafter Pound had told him, Klein began to deduce the process from the story. I think he lied in many areas, and it's impossible for a Viscount family to be so easily manipulated. If a child can notice something abnormal, how can the royal household and the churches not sense anything? After Rafter Pound degenerated, he had many chances to interact with outsiders and other aristocratic members. As long as he showed a little courage, he would be able to easily resolve the problem. Therefore, I think he must have been hiding something that has a high chance of being related to the underground structure. From the state of his mind, it seems that the evil spirit won't be able to escape for a long period of time, so I plan to get some explosives and destroy the entrance to prevent others from getting in. I'm afraid that I might accidentally release the evil spirit. Yes. Miss Bodyguard Sharon didn't confirm Klein's guess, but she didn't reject it either. At that moment, Klein hesitated and asked, I don't know much about demolition, so I'm preparing to draw a layout and hire a demolition expert to give me the positions to lay the explosives and their corresponding weights. If I ask you for help again, how much would I have to pay? If it's too expensive, it'd better for me to look for an ordinary demolition expert. After all, I'm getting only £50 from this, while Miss Bodyguard charges £1,000 for 3 days. Klein had already made plans. Free. Sharon's answer was still in her usual style of being terse. Free? Klein was shocked. From what he knew, free things cost the most. Sharon sat quietly for a few seconds before giving a brief explanation. After collapsing the entrance, I'll be the only one capable of entering and exiting. This was what I wished to do. In other words, after you're confident enough, you plan on getting rid of the evil spirit and harvest the items within? In fact, destroying the entrance is to help you eliminate any interferences or the greed of others. After all, other Beyonders of other sequences are unable to pass through the boulders and dirt like a spirit. Yes, apart from the apprentice pathway, but they don't know about that underground structure. Klein nodded in enlightenment. Deal. After saying that, he hurriedly added, Can you borrow a few more subordinates from Merrick, subordinates with a tight lip? They'll be helpers to show to Millet Carter. All right. Sharon didn't refuse. Klein deliberately didn't mention making any payment for that as he smiled. Then, let's schedule it for 10 in the morning tomorrow. We have to explore the surrounding terrain in advance. We can't let the explosion cause any obvious damage. Sharon nodded slightly as her figure faded away into nothingness. Saturday morning, Zio Dericha once again rode in a public carriage to the East Borough to confirm any results that her commissions might have. While waiting for the transfer, she suddenly had the urge to buy a newspaper to read. She took out a penny and bought a copy of the Backlund Bulletin from a paperboy next to her. She quickly read through it. Suddenly, her eyes froze because of the news article on the third page. At 7:10 last night, there was a serious explosion in the apartment building at 1 Dharavi Street in East Borough. It's suspected to be a result of a gas leak. The explosion happened at unit #03-06. The tenant died on the spot, to the point of not leaving a complete corpse. At press time, this explosion resulted in 3 deaths and 16 injured, 1 Dharavi Street. Apartment #03-06. Isn't this the place Williams rents? He's dead. He died from a gas leak explosion. No. Absolutely impossible. He would never be so extravagant and use gas, even if there was an installation there. Did he end up like this because he had just accepted my commission? But Lenevis is a wanted criminal. If he discovers that someone was looking for him, all he should need to do is move. There's no need to kill people to keep it a secret. Doing so would instead expose problems. The way this was done is too weird and radical, it's like it was done by a lunatic. He's clearly just a swindler. Poor Williams. I will definitely avenge you. I'll definitely find out the truth. Zio looked sadly and gravely at the public carriage parked in front of her and didn't choose to board it. She knew that it would be very dangerous to head to East Borough now. She intended to go back at once and tell Furs to get her to move to a spare rental house. Then, she would head to East Borough in a disguise and ask someone familiar to gain a preliminary understanding of the reason and find traces of the killer's tracks. Sigh, it's true that none of Miss Audrey's commissions are without danger. I thought that as long as I didn't stop someone who is already a wanted swindler and didn't stop him from escaping, he wouldn't retaliate in such a vicious manner. I was careless. I was the one who caused Williams's death. Well, that didn't exclude the possibility that he was also gathering information on other matters, thereby bringing about disaster. Zio closed her eyes and crossed the street to the waiting area on the other side. At 10:14, after confirming the surface conditions of the fourth epoch structure, Klein and Miss Bodyguard, Sharon, arrived outside the building at 8 Williams Street. Sharon had already vanished, and Millet Carter saw Detective Sherlock Moriarty in his grayish-blue worker's uniform and cap and his 3 taciturn assistants. It's convenient to explore like this, Klein explained. Millet Carter's eyes swept across the 3 assistants who were obviously good at fighting and nodded in satisfaction. Your preparations were quicker than I expected. Is one of them a snake-repelling expert? Yes, they're very good at repelling snakes. Klein didn't hesitate to give an affirmative answer. How could a zombie be afraid of being bitten by snakes? If it wasn't for the fact that he was a clown, he would have lost his balance and collapsed to the ground. Cough. 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 Having been distracted and caught unaware, he started to cough. He saw boulders and mud rapidly falling in front of him as they instantly blocked the entrance. During the remaining tremors, Klein gripped the copper whistle given to him by Mr. Azik and observed its reaction. Although he had divined beforehand that his expedition would be safe, he didn't dare to believe it completely, even if it was a revelation gained from above the grey fog since it involved the statues of the 6 Orthodox gods. Therefore, he cautiously judged whether or not the evil spirit was freed with the help of Azik's copper whistle. The copper whistle's surface was cold but mild, and it had no abnormal changes. Completely relieved, Klein looked at the zombies beside him and confirmed one thing from their eyes: his face was very dirty right now. That's good. It's in line with how I'm going to explain this to old Mr. Millet Carter. I didn't waste my effort in changing into a different set of clothes. He walked to the entrance and confirmed that it was completely blocked. Without causing too much of a commotion, it's true that only those from the apprentice path and beyonders like Miss Sharon can enter in the future. By doing so, she has ruled out many potential competitors. No wonder it was free. Klein looked at the boulders and dirt before sighing. Of course, I can too. I have a condition similar to a spirit body. He silently added this sentence inwardly with a smile, but his expression didn't change at all. Let's call it a day. With an exaggerated snap of his fingers, Klein led the 3 zombies back to the basement of the house. As for Sharon, she had already disappeared. In the spacious basement, Millet Carter was nervously pacing back and forth, looking at the secret door from time to time. As soon as he saw Detective Moriarty and his assistants exit, he let out a long breath and asked anxiously, "What happened inside?" Klein deliberately panted and said, "That underground structure is too old, it hasn't been repaired in a long time. We were driving the snakes away, but with just a little bit of movement, it collapsed. The whole area has collapsed, but luckily we were close to the door and managed to escape in time." Holy Lord of Storms! That structure was that dangerous? Millet Carter pounded his left breast. Yes, there are always only a few ancient buildings that can be preserved. The rest would have collapsed in the river of history, Klein answered. I'll bring you in to confirm the situation. Will there be more collapses? Millet asked cautiously. No, this area is quite sturdy. Klein deliberately patted the dust off his body and coughed twice. He then led his employer in and stopped at the entrance that was completely blocked. The walls near the hall had also collapsed, leaving behind only stones and dirt. You can use this area. He pointed to the corridor area. Millet was silent for a few seconds before he sighed. Thank goodness I didn't hastily send someone in to explore but instead went to look for you, a professional. Otherwise, I would have had to bear the burden of the loss of several lives. Alright, this commission ends here. I'll pay you the rest of the reward. As he spoke, Millet Carter took out his wallet, did a count, and was somewhat embarrassed to find that there were only about £30 in cash. Fortunately, I still have other forms of money, otherwise, I'd have to go to the bank, Millet mumbled as he looked up at Klein. Do you mind taking gold coins? No, I don't mind any form of money. Klein smiled. The gold pound of the Lone Kingdom could be in the form of gold coins unless they were of huge denominations. This was the guarantee of the denomination on paper money. However, in the past 100 years after Emperor Roselle, the people of the northern continent had become more and more accustomed to paper money. There were even some members of parliament who wanted notes to replace copper pennies. Gold, in the true sense of the word, already hardly ever circulated in the market. Only some of the old gentlemen would attach a fixed box on the other end of their pocket watch chains which contained some gold in case of accidents. It was to give them peace of mind and was also a habit. Millet nodded, and following the gold chain on his clothes, he pulled out a box that flickered with golden light from a certain pocket. He opened the box, took out 5 gold coins, and handed them together with the notes he had previously counted to the detective. Klein didn't hide his actions as he counted the money and suddenly flicked a gold coin and caught it coolly. Thank you for your generosity. He glanced up at the statue and smiled sincerely. Then he pressed his hand to his chest and bowed whilst facing Millet Carter. Yes, if it were any other detective, even if they demolished the entrance and the passageway, they would definitely have nightmares upon returning. They would hear things at home, and their minds will turn weak. They would feel like they're being watched all the time and experience other problems. That's the corruption of the evil spirit's aura. It will take a very long time before the effects disappear, but we're different. Miss Sharon is like a ghost to begin with. As for me, I'll be completely fine once I go above the grey fog. As for the 3 zombies, they aren't even afraid of death, so what's there to be afraid of? Klein lampooned while in a good mood as he bade Millet Cullen farewell and left his house. Arriving on the street, without even informing him, the three zombies walked in another direction. Miss Sharon is gone. She really didn't collect any money for the zombies. Klein smiled as he raised his arm and waved at the departing backs of the three zombies. Then, he went home and changed into his normal clothes and headed for the Quelag Club to practice shooting. After also settling his dinner there as a reward for the successful completion of his mission, Klein returned to Minsk Street in a public carriage. The dark, gloomy environment was illuminated by gas lamps, and with his cane, he strolled leisurely along the street. Suddenly, he had a premonition which wasn't too good or bad. What's going on? When Klein looked up, he saw two police constables with a dog on a leash, apparently investigating the streets. Investigation? An investigation with a police dog? Is this a result of the serial killings? The scene of the murder had the smell of cloves and gooseberries, so they included a police dog. Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon. The history of dogs dated back as far as the Roselle period, but the numbers had always been small. Considering that he had many things on him, and considering his earlier premonition, Klein decided to take a detour. But at that moment, the two policemen saw him and signaled for him to stop. The corner of Klein's mouth twitched as he waited in place with a smile on his face. Routine investigation. As they approached, one of the officers showed his identification documents. All right. Before Klein could finish his sentence, the police dog suddenly growled at him and barked endlessly. Is it because of the smell of gunpowder on me? The smell of gunpowder from my afternoon practice? Klein instantly realized what was happening. He looked at the faces of the two officers who were now on alert. With a thought, he smiled and said, "It's this, I picked up a revolver along the way, along with an armpit holster and bullets. I was planning on handing them over to the police." Slowly, he took out his revolver, raised his hands to his shoulders, and added with a serious smile, "Officers, I really am not bearing a gun illegally." As one constable remained on high alert, the other constable received the revolver and said seriously, "You have to come back to the police station with us." "All right," Klein returned with a radiant smile. "But I have a request. Please inform my lawyer, Mr. Jürgen Cooper. I will only accept a body search with him around." Chapter 280, The First Step in a Corner of East Borough. A drunken Xian faced the wall, pulled off his pants, and began watering the moss in comfort. When he was done, someone suddenly patted his shoulder. Xian couldn't help but shiver a few times. He picked up his pants and half turned to see a short boy in a canvas jacket and cap. The boy raised his head, revealing a mild and delicate face despite looking dirty. "Zio? Why are you dressed like that?" Xian blurted out in surprise. Zio put her index finger to her lips to indicate the need for silence. Then, she suppressed her voice and said, "I'll ask and you answer. Keep your voice down." Astonished by her awe-inspiring presence, Xian could only nod. "Which of the guys, that Williams knew, have died within the past 2 days?" Zio asked in a low voice. Xian used his alcohol-paralyzed brain to carefully think for a while and said, "Gavin. Gavin was found to have drowned in the Tussock River this morning. He probably fell into the river last night. The poor sod doesn't know how to swim and likes to enjoy the wind by the river when he's drunk." Zio's gaze suddenly became sharp. Without any hesitation, she asked, "Did Gavin accept Williams's request to look for the wanted criminal, Lenivas?" "Of course, we all got this commission from Williams. Anyway, it's not like it's a big deal. All we have to do is show the portrait to everyone we know and keep an eye out for someone who looks like him." "Oh, Williams, he said that if there's a clue, he'll treat me to 3 days of booze and meat. The poor fellow actually died in a gas explosion. That's why I refused to have my landlord install a gas pipe." "Ah. That was months ago. I can only afford a cheap motel now," Jean droned on. "What region is Gavin in charge of? Did he mention anything to you?" Zio looked sideways, pursed her lips, and stared straight at Xian. He usually goes to the dock area near the East Balam dock. He even met me yesterday evening and said that he went to the Workers' Alliance tavern there to spread the news of his search for Lenivis, and he also showed the portrait of Lenivis to everyone present. Jean hiccuped. There were many docks in Backlund, most of which were considered as the dock area and designated as shipyards. And after that? Did Gavin say what he was going to do? Zio asked again, frowning doubtfully. Of course, drinking. He planned to have a good drink and then find a place to sleep. Oh, the poor sod must have felt hot from drinking and wanted to take a bath in the river, but he forgot he couldn't swim, and it's almost winter. Xian sighed again. Gavin didn't discover anything. He had gone to the Workers' Alliance tavern in East Balam dock and distributed leaflets to search for Lenivis, but ended up meeting his demise. It even implicated Williams. The murderer's reaction can no longer be described as extreme anymore. It's as if I would frequently be invited to the police station for some coffee in the future. Pooey, they don't even give coffee. Theirs isn't even a cup of water. Before Klein could answer, he heard Jürgen add. For a private detective, getting in and out of the police station is something that happens every once in a while. It's an occupational hazard. Well, I know very well that every private detective has a problem with the illegal bearing of arms and the illegal trespassing in other people's homes. Your response this time was very good. The police couldn't find enough evidence to prove that you were bearing a gun illegally, and the explanation for the gunpowder reaction on your body was quite sufficient. The name Quelag Club was enough to convince them, otherwise, you most likely would have had to go to the magistrate's court. So, you're not a suspect, but a good citizen. A good citizen who picked up a gun and handed it in, so there was no need for a body search. All right. But I lost a revolver and the corresponding bullets. That's several pounds, and there's also the lawyer's fee. Klein squeezed out a smile. I understand. Lawyer Jürgen, let's establish a formal partnership. The corner of Jürgen's mouth twitched. With an extremely professional smile, he extended his hand and said, I hope for a pleasant partnership. I sincerely hope that I don't have to see you too often at the police station. That's not something that's up to me to decide. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. Back at 15 Minsk Street, Klein eased himself with a hot bath. But at that moment, he once again heard illusory prayers coming from a woman. Miss Justice. Is there a clue regarding Lenivis? Klein suddenly jumped out of the bathtub, quickly dried his body, put on his clothes, and went above the grey fog. Staring at the constantly expanding and shrinking crimson star, he extended his spirituality and chose to listen. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Honorable Mr. Fool, there's been a problem with the investigation of Lenivis. Justice, who was wearing a white gown for an unknown reason, recounted the explosion that happened on Duravi Street in East Borough, as well as Gavin's drowning. As a telepathist, who had already gained some mastery, she didn't add her own guesses, lest it affect the judgment of Mr. Fool. After listening carefully, Klein frowned, feeling that the killer's reaction was unimaginably extreme. Unlike Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, Lenivis, as a swindler, would immediately move if he discovered anything was amiss. That should be his professional instinct. There's no reason to follow the clues in reverse and kill those who are seeking him. According to this standard, 80% of East Borough's bounty hunters would die. This would cause a sensation and cause the case to be taken over by the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, or machinery hive mind. Has the benefits Lenivis gained, from the ritual of praying to the true Creator to send his son down, left him mad? This is very consistent with the style of the true Creator. However, the problem lies with the fact that it would be difficult for a lunatic to hide himself. Apart from the potential. Klein fell into deep thought and was in no hurry to respond to Miss Justice. He had read the newspapers and known about the explosion, so he used dream divination to recall the details. Then he wrote a new divination statement, clues to the explosion in Dharavi Street. As he recited it silently, he leaned back in his chair and entered a dream. He saw a 3-story, grayish-blue apartment. On the 3rd floor of the apartment, a room had lost its windows and half the wall had been destroyed. It was filled with signs of an explosion. The scene quickly shattered. Klein woke up from his reverie as he tapped the edge of the table and thought to himself. The clues are at the scene of the crime. This revelation can also mean that the murderer is still watching the crime scene and wants to finish off the person who comes to investigate the matter. Yes. This will give him a chance to find the person who recently issued the bounty for Lenivis. I'll visit the crime scene in disguise and see if I can find the killer. Even if he isn't Lenivis, he must surely be connected to Lenivis. But he must have hidden himself very well. How can I find him without attracting his attention? A thought flashed as Klein's eyes was cast onto the all-black eye on the long bronze table. This was a beyonder characteristic left behind by the Nimblewright master Rosago. In the real world, I can't use this item to manipulate those strange threads because of the residual mental corruption from the true creator. There will be irreversible harm after interacting with it for a certain amount of time. However, if it was used temporarily, I can use the threads to find a hidden person. That's something acceptable. It's just like how I used it to determine if Miss Bodyguard had left previously. Klein narrowed his eyes, removed his spirit pendulum, and divined if his trip would be dangerous. The answer was positive, but the amplitude and frequency of the spinning weren't excessive. That's acceptable. Klein was silent for a few seconds before returning to the real world. Then, by summoning himself, he placed the all-black eye into an iron cigarette case and brought it back to his bedroom. After changing his clothes, sticking his beard on, and getting ready, Klein came before the mirror and examined himself. The faint scholarly vibe that he had was completely concealed by the beard on his face, and his brown eyes seemed to be like an ancient pool which hid and sealed something within. Compared to when he was in Tinjin City, Klein almost didn't recognize himself. One by one, he stretched out his fingers and clenched them into a fist. Looking at the mirror, he said in a low and hoarse voice, "Captain, this is the first step to avenging both you and me." Before he finished his sentence, he saw himself grinning in the mirror, a brilliant smile on his face. Chapter 281, Clue in the suburbs west of Northborough, in a soon-to-be abandoned 3-story house. It originally belonged to the Backlund Medical School, but the latter's main campus had now moved to a better and more suitable location, leaving behind only a small number of teaching staff and students who were left guarding the area after failing to graduate. Audrey was wearing a white gown and white mask. Her smooth blonde hair was also coiled up and stuffed under a cool-colored surgical cap. She darted her eyes to the side and looked at Furs Wall, who was dressed in the same way. She always felt that Furs had a special temperament that seemed to make her more suited to such attires than herself. It's the kind of temperament that allows her to pick up a scalpel and cut open a patient's stomach at any moment. Audrey didn't say anything. She followed half a step behind Furs as they entered the classroom in front of them. She was startled by the information she had received from Furs because Mr. Fool had said it was a simple task. Considering that the simplicity of said task might be from Mr. Fool's point of view, Audrey took advantage of the moment when she was alone, changing into a disguise, to recite his honorable name and silently pray, so as to report everything that had exactly happened. However, she had yet to receive a response. After passing through the door and entering a room, Audrey instinctively looked around and found that this wasn't an ordinary classroom. There were actually 4 skeletal specimens and 4 coffins made of glass. The coffins were filled with pale naked corpses that were soaked in preserving agents. At the very top of the classroom, there was a transparent glass pillar that was also filled with a liquid. Floating inside was a male corpse that wore a black scholarly robe. The corpse's clothes stuck tightly to its body, giving off an extremely heavy feeling. He didn't relax and simply floated upright in the middle. It's as if he had died by drowning instead of being placed in there after his death. Audrey made a preliminary judgment based on her attitude as a spectator. In addition, she saw a number of men in white coats, white masks, and surgical caps sitting around the long tables in the room. None of them said a word, just like the bodies and bones around them. Looking out at the crimson moon which had finally peeked out of the gloomy darkness, Audrey turned her head back to look at the scene inside the classroom. For a moment, she couldn't help but shudder as this place instilled an instinctive fear. But at the same time, she felt excited and agitated. This is what the life of a Beyonder should be. Audrey silently muttered to herself as she followed Furs to a corner before sitting down. After waiting for a while, the floating black-clothed male corpse inside the upright glass pillar at the front of the classroom suddenly opened his eyes. His voice transmitted through the layers of obstructions. Let's begin. East Borough, Dharavi Street. In his dusty grayish-blue worker uniform and cap, he walked along the dark streets that only had a few gas lamps that were still working. There was candlelight shining down from the various apartments on both sides of the street. This was combined with the crimson moonlight that passed through the clouds with great difficulty, and they barely outlined the silhouettes of the pedestrians. Klein encountered people with old, tattered clothes, their faces numb with despair. They were the homeless who had been chased away by the police. They had no place to sleep, so they wandered aimlessly through the streets. Occasionally, they would find some inconspicuous corner or park bench to rest at for a while, but they were soon chased away again. In the cold and dark night, Klein felt that they were more like zombies than the zombies he had seen, and the entire East Borough was more like an abyss than the legendary abyss. He hurriedly took a quick breath which hurt his throat, causing him to cough involuntarily. He quickly gathered his thoughts and looked through the corner of his eyes at the apartment on the corner of the street. It had obviously suffered from an explosion and hadn't been repaired yet. The best place to monitor the crime scene is the apartment across the street. The third and fourth story and the roof all meet these requirements. Klein analyzed the situation with the knowledge he had learned as a nighthawk. Throughout the whole process, he didn't slow down his pace to avoid arousing suspicion. At the end of the street, Klein smoothly crossed the apartment building numbered 1 and entered the building across the street from the crime scene. The one-bedroom apartment he had rented in East Borough was similar to this apartment, and he had also lived in an apartment of slightly higher class with his brother Benson and sister Melissa in Tianjin City for quite a long time. It was Klein's personal experience, but it also came from the memory fragments of the original Klein. As his thoughts raced, Klein lowered his cap, lowered his head, and without rushing, he walked up the creaking stairs to the 3rd floor. Due to his unlucky encounter in the evening, he no longer had a revolver, so all he could do was stick one hand into his pocket and hold a few tarot cards in between his fingers. There was no light other than the faint moonlight in the corridor of the 3rd floor. Klein was in no hurry to move forward, so he carefully observed the layout. The spot directly across the crime scene is on the left. The one with the best view for surveillance should be the 3rd room from here. Klein began to walk slowly and carefully. After walking past 2 rooms, he also inserted his right hand into his pocket and gently opened the iron cigarette case. After a split second, his fingers touched the all-black eye, and the murmurs resounded in his ears as they attempted to tear his mind apart. At the same time, with the help of this corrupted item, Klein saw many strange black lines. These thin lines floated in the air, and although they were intertwined and entangled a little, he could still distinguish who they belonged to if he traced them back to the source. The corresponding figures were reflected in Klein's soon-to-be-cooked brain. There were men, women, and children sleeping in the bunk beds, and several tenants lying in bed on the floor. Other than that, there were no other special spots, nor were there any hidden figures. The illusion in front of him and the auditory hallucination in his ears slowly improved as Klein quickly retracted his hand from the all-black eye. He endured the pain as he continued to move forward. Once he felt some relief, he would immediately observe the other room. Unfortunately, his efforts of searching the entire apartment to see if there were any places that allowed the observation of the crime scene was in vain. Phew. Phew. Klein cowered in a corner of a balcony, his hands were on his knees as he panted heavily. Tears streamed from the corners of his eyes, and from time to time, his nose would run as if he had fallen sick. This was the result of his repeated contact with the all-black eye within a short period of time. Even with Klein's resistance in this area, he wasn't completely immune to it. The only thing that satisfied him was that it only agitated him and didn't corrupt him. Otherwise, he would have given up long ago and wouldn't have dared to try again. That would have led directly to devolving into madness. After resting for a while, Klein finally calmed down and switched to a different apartment that didn't have the same view as this one, but it was still for naught. Did I interpret it wrong? The clues are at the scene of the crime. When Klein returned to the street, he looked suspiciously out of the corner of his eye at the apartment with traces of an explosion. With the mindset of just giving it a try, he put his hand back into his pocket, pushed the metal cigarette case open, and stuck his hand inside. He wanted to see if anyone was hiding in the apartment where the crime scene was located. With a hum, Klein's head suddenly felt like it was being smashed as his body wobbled a little. Like a drunkard, he staggered forward and looked at the apartment which had signs of an explosion. As he was too far away, he couldn't clearly see the black lines, nor could he trace the source of the black lines. He could only barely distinguish where the black lines had gathered, and this indicated that there was someone present. No, no, no. Klein quickly swept the area and made a rough judgment. Suddenly, he noticed a black line floating out from the crime scene on the third floor which merged into the air. This. Klein's pupils shrank, and he made a confirmation before quickly withdrawing his hand so as to stop being in contact with the all-black eye. There's someone in the destroyed room. That murderer is actually crazy enough to wait for investigators to come to the crime scene. Isn't he afraid that official Beyonders will take over the case? I made a wrong judgment and failed to find him because I shared a different sense of logic from that of a lunatic. Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind as he slowly exhaled and pretended that nothing had happened whilst he walked in a circle until he reached the entrance of the apartment building. By then, all the negative effects he had suffered from the all-black eye had been quelled. Controlling his facial expression and body language, Klein headed up to the third floor as if he were going home, his footsteps quick and heavy with fatigue. In the darkness of the corridor, he caught sight of the doorless room which had half its walls collapsed. Then, he casually headed for the public bathroom. As he neared the room, his hand, which had been in his pocket, touched the all-black eye. Again, the mind-wrecking murmurs and the blurred hallucinations assaulted him. Through the corners of his eyes, Klein saw a black, illusory thread spread out from the crime scene. As he traced the source, he found a man who had completely merged into the shadows. His aura was the same color. The man was extremely tall, almost 2 meters in height. The corners of his mouth drooped slightly, making him appear rather eccentric. His cold eyes were like those of a wild beast's, possessing a ferocity that couldn't be hidden. It's not Lenivus. Klein withdrew his fingers, relaxed his body, and avoided the likelihood of staring. He entered the public bathroom at the end of the corridor without stopping. Nor did he alarm the man. The public bathroom and the crime scene weren't on the same side. He wiped off his cold sweat, and after quelling the negative effects, he directly jumped out the window, climbing down skillfully before leaving with brisk steps. He didn't stay a moment longer. He knew that in a few minutes the man would be alerted to the absence of someone who had gone to the bathroom, so he had to get as far away from the street as possible. It wasn't that Klein didn't want to walk back the way he came from, but if he didn't know which room he could go to, it would similarly expose him. The clown quickly ran and circled around a huge area before entering that one-bedroom apartment he had rented in East Borough. He then went above the gray fog to confirm that there was no danger of him being caught. That fellow must have had some sort of deep connection with Lenivus. After a moment's thought, Klein conjured a portrait of the man from earlier, sending his thoughts to the crimson star that represented Miss Justice. Soon after, he said solemnly in a tone of authority, "This is a clue." Chapter 282. This is East Borough. Inside the soon-to-be abandoned medical school building, Audrey suddenly felt adrift as she took a detour to leave the gathering which had just ended. She saw the familiar thick gray fog and the blurry figure situated in the center high above. "This is a clue." Accompanying Mr. Fool's solemn voice were scenes that looked like a film reel, a colored one at that. A man who wasn't particularly muscular but was nearly 2 meters tall in height was wearing a black priest robe and standing in the shadows. His light yellow hair was slightly curled, and his dark brown eyes were cold with malice. The corners of his mouth drooped slightly, making him look like a ferocious wolf. A clue. A clue to the bombing on East Borough's Dharavi Street and Gavin's drowning? Is this the murderer? Audrey stared blankly for a moment before immediately coming to an understanding. Mr. Fool already has a clue. He's really impressive. No, he's omnipotent. After sighing to herself, she turned to look at Furs. As soon as Furs removed her mask and surgical cap and got into the carriage, she noticed Miss Audrey's slightly strange gaze. She immediately asked in puzzlement, "Is there something on my face?" "Nope." Audrey looked away and sat down before removing her disguise. Furs recalled the gathering and asked curiously, "Miss Audrey, why didn't you announce that you were purchasing the Spectator formula? You could have established contact with the psychology alchemists that way." She remembered that the generous Miss Audrey had remained silent most of the time and only sold some spirituality-infused materials and responded to buying other varieties accordingly. Audrey smiled faintly and said, "This is my first gathering in this circle. I think it's more important to observe and wait. I'm looking forward to the potion formula and even more so, the mystical items, but I told myself that there's no rush. It would be a better strategy to familiarize myself before taking action. This is also a professional habit of the Spectator pathway. Moreover, there were no beyonder ingredients like dark-patterned Black Panther spinal fluid or Spring of the Elves marrow crystals which Mr. World wishes to obtain." Audrey silently added. Looking at the girl who wasn't 18 yet, Furs suddenly felt that she was more mature than ever before. She suddenly laughed at herself and said, "If I had been like you back then, I wouldn't have wasted such a precious opportunity." Audrey gave a reserved smile as a response before saying, "I'll ask some special friends in the morning if they have any leads on the Dharavi Street bombing. Wait for the information at the same place with Zio." "All right." Furs nodded without any doubts. Instead of returning to Minsk Street, Klein slept in the one-bedroom apartment in East Borough's Black Palm Street. He was afraid that the suspected murderer in the black priest robe had accomplices who could be searching the streets for him. Although the probability of meeting him wasn't high, and he had disguised himself ahead of time so that it was unlikely he could be recognized, his divination indicated that there was a possibility. To be cautious, Klein made do and decided to spend the night at East Borough. At dawn, he changed into another dark blue worker's uniform, put on a light brown cap, and left the room. He went down the stairs and into the street. At that moment, the white fog with a yellowish tint shrouded the surroundings. There were blurry figures of people passing by, and the cold morning air was soaking into their clothes. Klein lowered his head and hurried along, just like the people around him who had gotten up early for work. While walking, he saw a man in his 40s or 50s ahead of him. He wore a thick jacket and had gray hair around his temples. He was pacing in place and fumbling for a cigarette while shivering. Finally, he took out a box of empty matches in his clothes' inner pocket. Just as he opened the matchbox, his right hand quivered, and the crumpled cigarette fell to the ground and rolled in front of Klein. Klein stopped, picked it up, and handed it to him. Thank you. I can't live without this old friend. There's only a few left." The man thanked him sincerely and accepted the cigarette. His face was pale, and he appeared to not have shaved for quite a while. Exhaustion was expressed without reserve from the corner of his eyes as he lamented, "I haven't slept for another night, I don't know how long I can last. I hope the Lord will bless me so that I can enter the workhouse today." "He's a homeless person who has been chased away." Klein casually asked, "Why doesn't the king and ministers allow all of you to sleep in the park?" "Who knows? But to sleep in this kind of weather outside, it's very likely that you'll never wake up again. It's still better in the day, since you can find a warmer place." Sigh, "But this will make us lack the time or strength to look for jobs." The man lit a cigarette and sucked at it delightfully. As though he had some of his strength restored, and he walked beside Klein. It was uncertain if his destination was at the end of the fog or somewhere deep into the fog. Klein had no intention of exchanging pleasantries and was about to speed away from him when he saw the man, who had spoken clearly, bend down and pick up a dark object from the ground. It looked like an apple core that had been nibbled clean. The man swallowed his saliva before stuffing the dirt-covered fruit core into his mouth. He chewed it until it was mashed up before swallowing it down with great familiarity. Nothing was left. Looking at Klein's surprised eyes, he wiped his mouth, shrugged his shoulders, and smiled bitterly. "I haven't eaten in almost 3 days." This sentence struck Klein's heart, causing him to feel indescribably moved. He silently sighed and said with a smile, "Sorry, I didn't introduce myself just now. I'm a reporter, and I'm currently writing about homeless people. Can I interview you? Let's go to the cafe up front." The man froze for a moment before he smiled and said, "No problem, it's much warmer inside than on the streets. If you can stay a little bit longer after the interview and let me sleep inside for half an hour." "No, 15 minutes. That would be even better." Klein turned agape, momentarily at a loss for words. He just silently led his interviewee into the budget cafe at the end of the street. The tables and chairs in the coffee shop were quite greasy. Due to the walls and windows inside, there were quite a few guests. The average temperature was indeed much higher than the streets. The man scratched his throat, concealing his Adam's apple that was squirming from the fragrance. Klein motioned for him to sit down and went to order 2 large cups of tea, a plate of lamb stewed with young peas, 2 loaves of bread, 2 pieces of toast, a serving of low-quality butter, and a serving of artificial cream for a total of 17.5 pence. "Have some food to eat. We'll have the interview after you eat your fill." Once the food was ready, Klein carried them back to their table. "This is for me?" the man asked with anticipation and surprise. "Except for a piece of toast and a cup of tea, the rest is yours." Klein smiled in response. The man wiped his eyes and said with a slightly choked voice, "Why, you truly are a kind-hearted person. After starving for so long, make sure not to eat too quickly," Klein warned. "I know, I had an old buddy who died just like that." The middle-aged man worked hard at eating at a slower pace, occasionally lifting his cup of tea and gulping it down. Klein easily finished the toast and watched quietly, waiting for the man to finish his meal. "Phew, I haven't eaten until I was this full in 3 months, no, half a year. In the workhouse, the food they give is just enough." After a while, the man put down his spoon, leaving empty plates in front of him. Pretending to be a journalist, Klein asked casually, "How did you become a vagabond?" "It was bad luck, I was originally a worker leading quite a good life. I had a wife, 2 cute children, a boy and a girl, but a few years ago, an infectious disease took them away, and I also stayed in the hospital for a long period of time, losing my job, my wealth, and my family in the process. From then on, I often couldn't find a job, and I didn't have any money to rent a house or buy food. All I could do was wander on the different streets and in certain parks. This made me very weak, making it harder for me to find a job." The man spoke with a hint of nostalgia and sadness in his numbness. He took a sip of his tea, sighed, and spoke again. "I can only wait for an opportunity to enter the workhouse, but as you know, every workhouse only takes in a limited number of people. With good luck, and if I queue up in time, I can spend a few days in peace, recover my strength a little, and then find a temporary job. Yeah, temporary. Soon, I'll be jobless again and the previous process will be repeated. I have no idea how much longer I can last like that. I should have been a good worker. Klein thought for a moment and asked, "How many cigarettes do you have left?" "Not many left." The middle-aged man smiled bitterly. "This is the last of my assets, the only thing I have left after I was chased out by the landlord. Ha, one can't bring them into the workhouses, but I'll secretly hide them in the seams of my clothes. I'll only take one out to smoke during my worst hardships so that I can have some hope. I don't know how long I can last, but let me tell you, I was a good worker back then." Klein wasn't a professional journalist and was momentarily at a loss on what to ask. He turned his head to look out the window and saw faces with obvious hunger plastered across them. Some of them were relatively sober and they belonged to the residents of East Borough. Some of them wore looks of numbness and exhaustion, nothing like that of humans. They were vagabonds. There is no obvious gap between the two, the former can easily become the latter. For example, the gentleman in front of me. When Klein looked back, he discovered that the man had fallen asleep, his body curled up on a chair. After a few minutes of silence, Klein went to pat the man awake and gave him a handful of copper pennies. "This is the payment for the interview." Okay, thank you. The man didn't realize what was happening, and when Klein reached the door, he raised his voice and said, "I'll go to a budget motel and get a bath, get a good night's sleep, and then get a job." At noon, Klein attended a party at the Sammers. There were 10 guests. There was apple juice with steak, roast chicken, fried fish, sausage, cream soup, lots of delicacies, 2 bottles of champagne, and a bottle of red wine. On his way back from the bathroom, he met Mrs. Stellan Sammer. He thanked her sincerely, it was a sumptuous lunch. Truly delightful. "Thank you for your hospitality. It cost a total of £4 and 8 soldi. The most expensive were the 3 bottles of wine, but they were all part of Luke's collection. He has a liquor cabinet." The pretty Mrs. Stellan smiled in response. Without waiting for Klein to speak, she said, "You earned £10 from Mary's matter alone, and if you can keep up the good fortune, you'll soon be able to have a banquet like this. 4 people of our class, you have to invite friends once a month and also be invited by friends." Klein, who was already used to her mannerisms, obliged politely, "Well, I'll have to wait till my income settles at £400 a year before I can be like you." Stellan immediately raised her chin slightly and tried hard to make her smile faint. £430, it must be £430. Dock area, East Balham Dock, Workers' Alliance Tavern. Zio wore boots that gave her height a huge boost and stuck on a thick beard, making herself look like a short man. She tried to recall the portrait from Miss Audrey, trying to engrave in her mind the image of the man who might have been the murderer. If Gavin had been killed by him, the murderer probably frequents this tavern. Zio ordered a glass of rye beer and a lunch set before huddling in a corner and eating slowly. From time to time, she would look around furtively in search of her target. After a while, the tavern's door was pushed open again, and Zio reflexively looked over. With just one look, her pupils shrank so thin that they resembled needles as she nearly became petrified. The patron who entered was nearly 2 meters tall. Chapter 283, Dock Union. Zio has been in the bounty hunter business for a very long time. Many things were done on instinct without any thought. When she saw the patron who entered was nearly 2 meters tall, she instinctively lowered her head and continued to eat her pork sausage and French fries as if nothing had happened. Although the food entered her mouth, Zio didn't taste it at all. She endured dozens of painful seconds before she slowly raised her head and pretended to look around casually. Soon, she saw that the patron who had just entered was sitting in front of the bar counter, waiting for his booze and lunch. Soft, curly pale yellow hair, dark brown beast-like eyes, a slightly drooping mouth, an aura of solitude and malevolence. Little by little, the details came into Zio's eyes, overlapping with the image in her head. It's him. It's the suspected murderer. The man who killed Williams. Zio lowered her head again and slowly stuffed the rest of the food into her mouth. After a few minutes, she set the tray down on the bar, along with the glass, and left the Workers' Alliance Tavern without looking back. Due to her high boots, they effectively masked the most obvious features of her boots. Outside, Zio slowed her pace and found a secluded spot to observe the people entering and exiting the tavern. After waiting for a while, she finally found an acquaintance, a technician named Burton, who lived in East Borough and worked at the East Balham dock. The young man liked to treat himself to a cup of shoddy rye beer at noon or in the afternoon, and his salary only allowed him to afford such a beer, and he couldn't drink it every day. Zio nimbly darted over and patted Burton on the shoulder. She lowered her voice and said, "It's me, Zio." "Zio?" Burton looked up and down at the short man and nearly failed to recognize him as the famous arbiter Zio Derry Cha of the streets of East Borough. "I have something to ask you." Zio pointed to a nearby corner. Burton followed in puzzlement, only to come to a realization when he arrived in a secluded corner. "Are you doing a bounty mission?" He had heard that Zio was also a bounty hunter. "Yes." Zio nodded perfunctorily, fished out 5 pennies, and tossed them around. "Do you know that tall man at the tavern?" "You mean the one that's this tall, has pale yellow hair, and wears a fierce look?" Burton gestured. "Yes." Zio took out the folded portrait and unfolded it. "You have to be sure. That's him. He's been coming to this tavern often for the past 2 to 3 months. I've never seen him before that. He's very fierce, completely unreasonable, and he's good at fighting. It's best that you don't provoke him." Burton glanced at the portrait carefully and gave some sincere advice. "Yeah, when I saw that person just now, it was just like my encounter with a ferocious beast when I was young. I felt that I was in danger and wasn't a match for him, so I had to immediately avoid him." Zio secretly exhaled and asked, "Do you know anyone he's in close contact with?" "No idea. He's not very sociable and he seldom speaks. We don't even know what his name is. We have given him a nickname, Giant." Burton curled his lips and shook his head. Zio thought for a while before asking again, "Where else have you met him, besides the tavern?" "You can ask your friends the same question. Remember, it has to be a trusted friend." Burton recalled and said, "When I went to the dock union to do some work, the East Balham Docks Dock Union, I would occasionally see him appear there." "Zio, why aren't you a member of the union?" "You're so just, and those guys not only charge us 1.5 solely a week. But when the other docks go on strike, they'll pay us half our salary just because we have to support our families. Lord, let's just forget about it. In order to live a good life, we must help each other. However, once they organize a strike, they'll come to an agreement with the lawyers sent by those rich people. Our situation doesn't improve at all." "Stop, stop." Zio lowered her right palm and said, "Apart from that, have you seen Giant anywhere else?" "No, my friends probably haven't either. After all, we often discuss him in private," Burton answered in a firm tone. Zio didn't say anything more and gave him 5 copper pennies. "Drinks on me. Don't tell anyone about what I just asked. It'll be very dangerous." Before she finished her sentence, she had already turned around the corner and headed towards the dock union located at East Balham Dock. About 10 minutes later, Zio saw the 2-story yellow building. She wore her canvas coat inverted and exposed the patches beneath, instantly transforming herself from a short worker to a vagabond. Zio looked at the homeless people huddled around the corner, pinched her nose, and went over to sit down beside them. She glanced at the dock union on the opposite side of the street where people were coming in and out. As the minutes passed, Zio endured the cold and the harsh environment while tenaciously observing the situation around the dock union and the surrounding area. She clearly remembered Williams's insistence on drinking, and she also remembered how she felt when she saw the newspaper that fateful day. These feelings made her even more patient than usual. At that moment, about 8 people came out of the dock union, and they headed for the cafe across the street to have lunch in groups. Zio narrowed her eyes and carefully scanned every passerby to confirm their appearance. There's no one suspicious. Zio was about to look away and wait for the next batch of people when the door to the coffee shop creaked and was pulled open as the heat from within rushed out. A man couldn't help but take off his gold-rimmed glasses and wipe away the fog with his sleeves. Chapter 284, Instinctive Trembling 3 in the afternoon at the dock union in East Balham Dock. Klein wore a thick sweater, a tan jacket, and a simple cap that brought him closer to the usual investigative reporters in style rather than the ones who attended banquets and interviewed people of status from time to time. Such a costume had cost him an extra £1.10 solely. At that moment, he was wearing gold-rimmed glasses, and his hair was neatly combed back, gleaming with the luster of hair oil. His face no longer had a messy beard, so he could only plaster a deep black stubble around his lips. His height was at least 5 centimeters taller than before. He was trying his best to look different from the worker from last night, making it impossible for anyone who wasn't particularly familiar with him to make any associations. In the pockets of his clothes and trousers, there was no all-black eye, no charms or herbal essential oils. There was only a deck of tarot cards, a stack of notes, a fountain pen, a wallet, some change, a bunch of keys, and false reporter identification documents. He didn't know the Lenivas' current condition, nor did he know where the powerful beyonder lingering around him came from. Hence, out of precaution, he didn't bring any suspicious items. Looking at the 2-story building ahead of him, Klein crossed the street, pretending to not rely on the clown's intuition to notice that several pairs of eyes were watching him. He pushed open the door and saw that the dock union's layout was rather simple. There were no female receptionist or spacious lobbies. The stairs to the second floor were in the middle, flanked by office corridors, and the floors weren't lined with wooden planks, much less carpet. They were paved purely out of cement. Klein turned his head to look at the man guarding by the door as he went over and said, "I'm a reporter from the Backlund Daily Tribune. I would like to interview the workers of your association and get to know your needs and desires." The man was wearing a very patched jacket which even had dirty cotton lining exposed and a linen shirt underneath. After hearing the word reporter, he suddenly became vigilant and replied loudly, "No. We haven't organized a strike lately, no. I think you've misunderstood me. I'm someone who sympathizes with you. I'm planning on doing a special report on what the union does to help the workers and the actual difficulties they encountered. Trust me." With the help of his clown beyonder powers, Klein made his eyes look abnormally sincere. "Is that so? Go to Mr. Rand, our committee member in charge of publicity. Turn right, and it's the second office on the right." The man hesitated for a few seconds before replying. "Thank you." Klein bowed with feigned relief, and he felt the gaze observing him from a dark corner of the room vanish. He turned to his right and, with his back perspiring in cold sweat, knocked on the office door. The door creaked open. A middle-aged man with sparse hair looked at him and asked, "May I know who you are?" "Mr. Rand? I'm reporter Statham from the Backlund Daily Tribune. This is my reporter identification documents. I'd like to make a report with unions as the theme to help you acquire more attention." Klein almost believed he was a journalist. "That's me." The middle-aged man looked at the reporter's identification documents and said hesitatingly, clearly unwillingly, "It's hard for me to believe that you reporters are here to help us. I was born in East Borough, and I know how miserable the lives of the workers are. If you don't believe me, you can follow me the entire time and monitor my every question." Klein suddenly smiled and added, "A report with actual interview data would be better than nothing, far better than news that's written purely based on imagination." At least you can provide your views and hopefully guide things in the direction you want. Rand touched his scalp and replied hesitantly, all right then. I'll follow you the entire time. Thank you. Klein almost lost control of his emotions. Afterward, under Rand's guidance, he entered one office after another, interviewing the members of the Workers' Association according to his prepared questions. Right corridor, nothing. Left corridor, nothing. Klein calmly went up the wooden stairs to the second floor. This time, Rand led him into the office directly opposite the staircase and introduced the people inside. This is a reporter from the Backlund Daily Tribune, Mr. Statham. He wants to interview the lot of you, but I have to remind you that there are some questions which you have the right to refuse to answer. Klein smiled, took 2 steps forward, and made a gesture to shake hands with each and every staff member in the room. At that moment, he saw a slightly familiar figure. Although the man's skin had turned bronze, his ordinary round face had become angular, and his glasses had changed from a round frame to a gold-rimmed frame. Klein still found a trace of familiarity from his spirituality as a seer. Immediately afterward, his body trembled, and the smile on his face almost went out of control. I am sorry. I suddenly have a stomachache. May I ask where the washroom is? Klein asked with an awkward smile, holding his stomach with the hand that didn't hold a pen and paper. Rand and the staff didn't suspect anything. They all pointed to the door and said, go out, turn left. When you reach the end, you'll see the sign. Klein smiled apologetically and walked out of the room, heading quickly for the washroom. Inside, he selected the cubicle closest to the window, sat on the toilet, and locked the wooden door behind him. He bent down, the corners of his mouth curving into a silent laugh. He laughed so hard he nearly couldn't keep his body straight. A drop of sparkling liquid fell onto the ground from his laughter. Klein had confirmed that it was Lenivas. This wasn't because of that small sense of familiarity, but because he felt another type of aura from the other party's body, one that left an extremely deep impression on him. This was also the main reason why he had nearly lost control on the spot. The trembling of his body originated from his instinctive fear. The collapse of his emotions came from the horror and sorrow deep within his memories. That was the aura of the true creator. Klein washed his face and went on with the interview as if nothing had happened. Even while facing Lenivas, who had somehow changed so much, he continued to ask questions and record the answers. After finishing all of this, he bade farewell to the Workers' Association and walked out of the dimly lit building. Outside, the sky was cloudy and misty, as if the evening had come early. The true creator's aura can only come from his body or spawn, as well as things that extend from the two. For example, items bestowed by him, or his godhood. This corroborates with what Lenivas said to Hood Eugen. In addition, there's that tinge of familiarity. I didn't even need to go above the gray fog for divination to confirm that it's him. If it wasn't for me having already interacted with the true creator a few times and coming close to his mental corruption, there's no way I could have recognized that aura to be his, which didn't contain any strength and of his nature. Klein felt heavy emotions, but he appeared very relaxed. He stood on the street and purposely organized the interview notes. In the process, he caught a glimpse of a slightly familiar figure among the vagabonds across him. Miss Zio? Klein instantly made a guess with what he knew. He didn't stop, and he put away the notes before walking towards the tracked public carriage station. At this moment, a horse carriage suddenly stopped in front of him. We meet again. Sitting in the carriage was a thin, elegant, middle-aged gentleman with white hair at his temples. He was the great detective who was helping the police investigation, Isengard Stanton. As for Klein, he didn't look any different than usual. He was just a little taller and had changed into a new set of clothes. What a coincidence, I was just thinking about the last time I interviewed you, Klein answered deliberately. Isengard suddenly understood and changed the subject with a smile. I'm here to investigate a case. The death of Sibir has been eliminated and I'm in charge of it. Her death is very close to East Balham Dock. So it's indeed a copycat crime? Klein feigned ignorance. After exchanging a few pleasantries, he got into the tracked public carriage. Instead of going straight home, he made a transfer and headed to the Quelag Club in Hillston. In the club's lounge, he quickly went above the grey fog to confirm that no one was following him. Only at this step did Klein completely relax and feel some lingering fear. The aura of the true creator lingered in his mind like a nightmare, leaving the clothes on his back moist after they repeatedly dried. To be sure, Klein conjured a yellowish-brown goatskin parchment and a dark red fountain pen before writing a divination statement he had already long thought of, the source of the inexplicable familiarity earlier. Putting down his fountain pen and leaning back into his chair, he began to mumble as he entered the dream. In that grey and illusory world, he saw a figure. This figure had ordinary facial features. He wore round glasses, and he had a condescending and taunting smile from beginning to end. He was none other than Lenivus. "I've finally found you." Klein no longer used his clown ability to control his facial expressions as he muttered to himself through clenched teeth. Then, he sat up straight and prepared to answer Miss Justice's prayer. Klein controlled his emotions and said in a deep but cold voice, "There's no need for confirmation. That is Lenivus. You can inform the Church of the Evernight Goddess and tell them that Lenivus has the godhood of the fallen creator." Audrey, who was watching her father train the hunting hounds with Susie, froze when she heard Mr. Fool's response. "Fallen creator? Isn't that the true creator? That swindler actually has the godhood of the true creator. Such a simple mission actually involves the godhood of the true creator." As expected, I knew Mr. Fool had other deeper motives. He was targeting the true creator. As expected of Mr. Fool. Many thoughts flashed through Audrey's mind. Chapter 285, Midnight Bell Tower. Audrey, who had set up an urgent communication method with Zio and Furs, quickly passed on Mr. Fool's message to the two ladies through the huge golden retriever, Susie, claiming that the information she had received came via other sources. In the corner of an old church, as Zio was thinking about how to confirm Lenivus's identity, or how she should create chaos and avenge Williams, she unfolded the ball of paper. "There's no need to confirm. He's Lenivus." Zio's eyes widened as she quickly skimmed through the rest of the paper's content. The piece of paper clearly wrote, "The only choice is to notify the Church of the Evernight Goddess. Alert them that Lenivus has the godhood of the true creator on him." Godhood? The true creator's godhood? Zio blurted out as she looked at the golden retriever in front of her in shock, only to realize that she was equally dumbfounded. What? Furs was listening when she suddenly felt something was amiss. She hurriedly reached out for the piece of paper and scanned it. After a moment, she curled her lips and said at a loss, This must be a joke, right? How did we get involved in a matter that's tied to an evil god's godhood? This was meant to involve the capture of a cunning swindler worth only £200. In response to Furz's question, Susie could only express the notion that she was only a dog and that she didn't know what was happening either with her innocent eyes. Not expecting a dog to answer her questions, she turned her head to Zio and said, "I'm afraid Miss Audrey isn't as naive and innocent as we thought. She has many secrets. This might be a power struggle between a cult, the nobles, and the church. However, it's evident that she didn't know about the matter of godhood prior to this. She's also being used by someone. That person could be her father, Count Hall. What's fortunate is that this matter ends here. You don't need to take the risk anymore. After you get someone to make the report, you just need to wait to collect the bounty in peace." Zio was startled and said, "That's true. Hopefully, those Nighthawks are able to avenge Williams. They're so strong, so they'll definitely be able to do it." Definitely. Before she finished speaking, she suddenly turned her head to the side and spoke as if she was talking to herself, "I'm still too weak." Too weak. Zio jerked her hand up, covering her mouth and nose. I'm still too weak. If not for that, I would have chosen to take revenge myself, but right now I can only take a step back. Not to mention there's Giant and those hidden helpers around Lenivis. With just his godhood, he isn't someone I can deal with. With the reaction speed of the Nighthawks, they'll likely take action tonight once they receive the report. The Backlund Diocese is second only to the church's headquarters. They have many sealed artifacts and many powerful Beyonders. There's no need to wait for any additional helpers. After completing his task of informing Audrey, Klein returned to the real world. He stuck on a beard, changed his hairstyle, and stared into the mirror for several minutes. He felt anticipation and excitement, as well as depression and a sense of powerlessness. Before the evening arrived, he left the Quelag Club and returned to Minsk Street. On his way, he went to the grocery market and found a stall that was bustling with its great business. He bought several masks, including a clown's. He had decided to watch the hunt for Lenivis tonight. He wanted to see the other party pay the price for his madness with his own eyes. Of course, with his strength, he could only watch from a distance and not even have the right to approach them. By 11 o'clock, when many people were in their dreams, Klein changed into his grayish-blue worker's uniform and disguised himself as he had the night before. Then, he put on his cap, walked a few streets away, and took a rental carriage to the Backlund Bridge area. Once there, he switched to walking and walked all the way to the East Balham dock. His interview yesterday included questions such as, "Where are you staying now?" and "How's the environment like?" Therefore, he knew very well that Lenivis would be staying in the dormitory provided by the dock union at night. However, Klein didn't go near it. Instead, he carefully went around it. His target was the clock tower of the East Balham dock. In Backlund, in addition to the large church with its tall, iconic clock tower, many government buildings were also equipped with one. However, they weren't necessarily tall, grand, and not ornate. It was mostly built for pragmatic reasons, such as this one in the East Balham dock. Compared to the surrounding buildings that reached a maximum of 3 stories, it was like a giant that stood high in the night sky as it overlooked the entire area. Klein easily entered the interior of the clock tower and went up the endless flight of spiral stairs as he moved quickly in the darkness. Finally, he arrived at his destination. He arrived at the top of the gigantic wall clock. It was surrounded by a dark yellow fence, and at the top of his head was a steeple that could be reached by stretching his hand. Taking a few steps forward, Klein hid in the shadows, got a sense of his bearings, and looked towards the dock union's dormitory. It was a 2-story, brick-red building, and the occasional pedestrian resembled a black dot in Klein's eyes. He stared for a few seconds, then took a step back, and sank into the darkness. At the same time, he took out his newly bought mask and wore it. It was a clown with the corner of its mouth sharply raised and a painted red nose. A happy clown. Wearing a clown mask, Klein stood in the rich darkness, patiently waiting for the predetermined show. He waited for 2 hours. When the hands of the large wall clock passed 1 o'clock, he suddenly saw something flying from the distance. It was a huge airship covered in dark black paint. If it weren't for the faint moonlight, it would have been indistinguishable from the night sky. Unlike what was described in the newspapers and magazines, depicting them as machines that emitted exaggerated mechanical noises, its oars rotated quietly, as silent as a vulture who had found its prey but hadn't found a chance. The solid, light alloy supported the cotton frame, and below it hung the compartment for guns, projectile launchers, and cannons. At a glance, it appeared to be a powerful deterrent. It's silent. Is this a temporary result caused by Beyonder means? Klein, wearing his clown mask, looked at the slowly descending airship and made a guess. At this moment, he was most puzzled over the dispatch of an airship for a small-scale Beyonder battle in a densely populated area of the city. Aren't they afraid of dealing collateral damage to the surrounding citizens? Aren't they afraid of causing panic? Very soon, the airship hovered about 10 meters in the air. This way, Klein was even less worried about being discovered. His position was much higher than them. Observing the situation below, he suddenly had a hunch. It was likely that the airship wouldn't engage in combat, but rather provide air surveillance of the area to give the personnel involved in the operation a better view and prevent the target from escaping if any accidents occurred. Right at this moment, 3 figures dressed in black robes suddenly appeared in front of the 2-story brick-red building. The man in the lead didn't wear a hat, revealing his short golden-brown hair and blackish-green eyes which appeared to be as deep as a windless lake. The collars of his shirt and windbreaker were propped up high, and his palms were covered with a layer of gloves that were as red as blood. A silver-white metal suitcase was wound around his left hand via a chain of the same color. This was one of the 9 high-ranking deacons of the Church of the Evernight Goddess, Christet Sesamir. He was also one of the 3 powerhouses of the Red Gloves, and he happened to be in Backlund. After looking straight ahead, Sesamir turned his head to the left and said to his subordinate, "Use sealed artifact 1-63. Yes, Your Grace." The Nighthawk crouched down and helped Sesamir untie the chain around the silver suitcase. Throughout the entire process, Christet Sesamir's muscles were very tense, as though he was fighting something. The Nighthawk on the left took a deep breath and pressed down suddenly, causing the illusionary ripples on the surface of the silver box to crack. The surrounding halo suddenly disappeared as if it was completely sucked into the case. A bone sword, that was less than a meter long, emitted glossy, pure white light as it slowly floated up. Its blade had an ancient silver-coated mirror attached to it. In the rich darkness, a roar filled with pain and horror instantly sounded, and it was immediately swallowed up by tranquility and serenity. Sesamir stood up and drew out the bone sword. A drop of dark red blood was slowly dripping down its tip, and on the floor, flesh and blood were seeping out, congealing into a face of despair. It was precisely the giant, who had a slightly drooping mouth. Pat! 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 3 shadows appeared around Sesamir in succession. However, they all mysteriously collapsed to the ground, having been forcefully taken down by many invisible entities. Bang! 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 Another Nighthawk fired, and the silver surface of the bullet seemed to bear the Evernight sacred emblem. The 3 attackers hiding in the shadows suddenly revealed themselves, twitching as they lost their breath. Rose Bishop, Shadow Ascetic. People from the Aurora Order. Sesamir frowned and said in a low voice without turning to his companions, "There's something wrong about this. It's very strange. All of you be careful." Before he could finish his words, he heard the shuffling of footsteps which echoed in the silence and serenity. Immediately, he saw Lenivus with his chiseled face dressed in a linen shirt walking down the dark staircase. He appeared calm and placid without any signs of fear. "I'm very curious. To the Aurora Order, you should be a blasphemer. Why would they send people to protect you?" Sesamir didn't seem to notice the abnormality as he asked casually. Lenivus showed his trademark taunting smile and said, "That's simple. Because I'm no longer just Lenivus." He paused for a moment, and his gaze suddenly turned cold. "Now, I'm even more of the true creator." He yanked open his linen shirt, revealing the dark red flesh of his skinless chest and abdomen. The flesh and blood were conjoined together, forming the figure of a hanged man. All of a sudden, the void around them shattered like glass, and all the scenes around them crumbled. This was the aura of a deity. Chapter 286, A taunting smile in the clock tower of East Balam Dock. Klein hid in the darkness while donning a clown mask as he quietly stared at the dormitory of the dock union. An airship floated above. He couldn't see the details of the battle, and he had no way of knowing the developments of the operation in the red brick building. All he could do was endure and determine the situation by observing the changes in the surroundings and the occasional black dot that passed by. Just then, he saw all the gas lamps in the area extinguish. All of them had been extinguished. It was pitch black there. Right on the heels of that, a feeling that left an extremely deep impression on him exploded from the small red brick building. Even from a long distance away, Klein couldn't help but tremble all over, his legs went soft, and he bent his waist. It was the feeling of being looked down upon, a feeling that repressed one's spirit. It was a feeling that was impossible to resist or face. No, don't look directly at God. In his adrift thoughts, Klein seemed to recall the time when he was in the hall of the Blackthorn Security Company. It was like when he was about to activate his spirit vision to probe the mental state of Megos and the baby in her womb. That feeling was exactly the same as it was now. No, it's even more extreme and terrifying right now. How could this be? Wasn't Lenivus just bestowed with a little bit of the true Creator's godhood? At most, he would be given one or two other corresponding items. Why does it feel like an evil god is about to descend? Before Klein could shake off the trembling of his body in the numbing of his thoughts, he suddenly felt a deep, serene, and profound darkness engulfing the feeling that couldn't be looked at, probed, or resisted. The two sensations were obliterated at the same time, causing the gas lamps in the surrounding area to light up once again. The airship which couldn't stop itself from plummeting floated back up again. Everything seemed to return to its original state, without the slightest change. But Klein didn't believe that everything was over. He stood up with all his might, knowing that something important had happened in the red brick building. The feeling that exceeds a beyonder, at a fundamental level, is no longer there, nor is there the feeling of the descent of an evil god. This means that the true creator or Lenivus's plot has failed. However, the Nighthawks must have suffered some sort of serious blow as well. They might not even have much strength left. At that moment, Klein's heart stirred. He quickly took out the spirit pendulum inside his left sleeve, holding it with one hand as he said in a low voice, "Lenivus is no longer dangerous at the moment." After quickly repeating it 7 times, he opened his eyes and saw that the topaz pendant was rotating counterclockwise. However, its frequency wasn't fast, and its amplitude wasn't large. This showed that Lenivus was still a dangerous man but to a lesser degree. What caught Klein's attention was something else. The divination hadn't failed again. This meant that Lenivus had been separated from the godhood bestowed upon him by the true creator. A cold wind blew, seeping deep into Klein's bones, causing him to shiver. He felt as if an electric current had instantly drilled into his brain from the soles of his feet. Maybe I can do something. He suddenly had this thought and no longer hesitated. He took 4 steps counterclockwise in the dark clock tower and went above the gray fog. Without wasting any time, he sat down and conjured a piece of yellowish-brown goatskin parchment and wrote a divination statement, Lenivus's escape route. Klein leaned back, quickly chanted the statement, and entered a deep dream. In that illusory, separated, misty world, he saw the slush-filled sewers with their dark, dirty tunnels and rusty metal pipes. It was cramped and sealed. It's the sewers. Klein immediately woke up, enveloped his body with spirituality, and descended into the gray fog. As soon as he returned to the real world, he took a few steps back and came to the side of the clock tower that faced away from the airship. Klein didn't walk down the spiral stairs but instead somersaulted over the dark yellow fence. With the help of the platform, the bulging spots, and the decorations on the surface of the building, he jumped down level by level. His body was so balanced it was as though he was walking on the ground. In a very short period of time, his feet stepped on the thick flagstones on the street. Inside the small red brick building, 2 Nighthawks wearing red gloves had collapsed by the door unconscious. The ancient silver-plated mirror had rolled to a corner, but it was no longer special. It no longer looked anything like a Grade 1 sealed artifact. However, one could clearly feel that it was recovering bit by bit. Krestet Sesamir was kneeling at an intersection, a stream of tear-like blood streaked down the corners of his eyes. His short, golden-brown hair hung limply, and his standing collars on his windbreaker and shirt were in tatters, revealing his relatively sharp chin and his thin, stiff mouth. Gasping for air, a distorted, semi-illusory, and translucent face appeared on each of his teeth. Casimir braced himself with his left red-gloved hand on the ground. With difficulty, he straightened his neck and looked straight ahead. Directly in front of him was the staircase to the second floor, above which stood Lenivas, who had his linen shirt completely unbuttoned. Lenivas stood very straight, with the pure white, smooth-boned sword stuck in his chest. The skinless flesh no longer formed the outline of the hanging man's figure, leaving behind a void. Vaguely, one could even see his back through the hole in Lenivas's body. Lenivas moved with great difficulty before suddenly laughing loudly. He said with a maniacal laugh, "Haha, haha, thank you. I really need to thank you. For real. Look at my sincere eyes. I really want to thank you. If you hadn't discovered me and arrived in time, I would truly become the vessel of the true Creator when He descends in a few months. When that happens, how different would it be from dying?" Casimir was stunned when he heard that. He refused to believe that the person who had his crutch destroyed thanks to his hard work would be so happy. At that moment, he wished to stand, but he couldn't. He was also powerless to resist. When Lenivas saw his confusion, he coughed and said with a smile, "Do you know? To people like me, it's the most miserable thing when there's no one to share a great accomplishment that I'm proud of. Cough, when I was in Tianjin City, I was deceived by the true Creator who not only initiated the descent of his spawn, but he also secretly planted a sapling in my body. No, I even believe that Migos's child was just his ruse. He didn't even get the members of the Aurora Order to protect her to divert attention. It was as though he knew from the beginning that the ploy would end in failure. His true descent was set up inside me. The godhood he bestowed upon me suddenly combined with the sapling in my body after I reached Backlund. Ha, can you imagine that? I was being replaced bit by him. In the end, I would become the true Creator. Before I came up with a solution, I was found by the members of the Aurora Order through the godhood. Thankfully, they're all lunatics with simple brains. Ha, there are always so many fools. Cough. 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 Lenivas spat out a mouthful of foul blood, seemingly recovering some of his mobility. He took a difficult step forward, and his chiseled face suddenly turned soft for some unknown reason as he began resembling his original self. Lenivas reached out to the staircase's handrail and laughed tauntingly. Thankfully, if the true Creator wishes to fully descend and completely replace me, he'll need large amounts of pessimism, despair, numbness, resentment and primitive evil. Only Backlund, only East Borough, the factory and dock area, could satisfy his requirements. This gave me a chance to interact with others. I knew that it was unrealistic to report this to the police simply through the people I interacted with because the people I come in contact could very well be members of the Aurora Order. I initially wanted to instigate a strike to get the police to notice me, but I was warned by someone from the Aurora Order. After being tortured, I could only hastily end it. I acted as though I was on the brink of losing control and had gained the opportunity to head into the sewers to vent. During this process, I secretly used my blood to corrupt the creatures living in there, turning them into terrifying mutated monsters. Unfortunately, before you could fully investigate the reason behind it, it was discovered by the Aurora Order. Apparently, a member of theirs died under a mutated monster. Sigh, now that I no longer have the godhood or the sapling, my blood no longer has such effects. After that, I was controlled even more strictly, but I still found an opportunity. I killed a prostitute and used the cruelest method to attract the attention of the police, but who would have thought that the people of the Aurora Order would disguise the case as part of series of serial murders? I still failed to receive the rescue I needed. Out of similar opportunities, I could only use a more ingenious method. I took the initiative to request for the fiercest, craziest, most radical member of the Aurora Order to watch me, and this suited their thoughts. Hee, can't they use their brains? Such a lunatic would get into trouble at any moment. As expected, you guys came. Phew. At that moment, Lenivus exhaled and began to move his body, as if he had finally gotten rid of the remnant effects. He pulled out the holy bone sword from his chest and said regretfully, "What a pity. I can't take it with me, otherwise, I would be quickly tracked and found by you." After the pure white bone sword completely separated from his body, not a single drop of blood remained from the exaggerated wound. The part that had disappeared didn't seem to belong to Lenivus. Lenivus pressed his right hand against his chest, bowing as he faced Crestet Casimir and company. "The people on the airship outside should be recovering soon. I can't stay any longer. Thank you very much. Although you're all very stupid, you still ultimately helped me. It's an honor for foolish bastards like yourselves." Having said this, he straightened his body and smiled tauntingly, "Goodbye, foolish nighthawks. Use your lives to send me off." Grasping the bone sword in his hand, he abruptly took a few steps forward, attempting to stab at Crestet Casimir. But at that moment, his eyelids began to grow heavy, as he felt like collapsing into a slumber. "So you still have some strength. This is troublesome." Lenivus bit his tongue gently and suddenly threw the holy bone sword at the unconscious nighthawk by the door. "No." Casimir waved his hand with the strength he accumulated through painstaking means, causing an invisible entity to divert the holy bone sword. Lenivus seized that opportunity and dashed to the side. He somersaulted out the red brick building through the window at the washroom at the end of the corridor. Soon after, he opened a manhole cover along the streets and quickly climbed into the sewers. Lenivus seemed to be very familiar with this place. Even though it was dark, he could still run, jump, and turn, quickly fleeing deep into the maze of sewers. Suddenly, he instinctively stopped and leaned back. Oof! A card had stabbed deep into his right chest and blood began dripping profusely from its edge. Lenivus looked up, and with his ability to see in the dark, he saw his attacker. It was a medium-sized man in a worker's uniform, wearing a mask with a raised mouth and red nose. It was a happy clown. "You're tuning into the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.